Part 9, Chapter 16 of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Valley of Aosta and Ascent of the Grand Jorasses. The valley of Aosta is famous for its bouquetins and infamous for its cretins. The bouquetin, steinbock or ibex, was formerly widely distributed throughout the Alps. It is now confined almost entirely or absolutely to a small district in the south of the valley of Aosta, and fears have been repeatedly expressed in late years that it will speedily become extinct. But the most sanguine person does not imagine that cretinism will be eradicated for many generations. It is widely spread throughout the Alps. It is by no means peculiar to the valley of Aosta, but nowhere does it thrust itself more frequently upon the attention of the traveller, and in no valley where every prospect pleases is one so often and so painfully reminded that only man is vile. It seems premature to fear that the bouquetins will soon become extinct. It is not easy to take a census of them, for although they have local habitations, it is extremely difficult to find them at home. But there is good reason to believe that there are at least 600 still roaming over the mountains in the neighborhood of the valleys of Grisonche, Rheims, Savaranche, and Cogne. It would be a pity if it were otherwise. They appeal to the sympathies of all as the remnants of a diminishing race, and no mountaineer or athletic person could witness without sorrow the extinction of an animal possessing such noble qualities, which a few months after birth can jump over a man's head at a bound without taking a run, which passes its whole life in a constant fight for existence, which has such a keen appreciation of the beauties of nature and such disregard of pain that it will stand for hours like a statue in the midst of the bitterest storm until the tips of its ears are frozen, and which, when its last hour arrives, climbs to the highest mountain peaks, hangs on a rock with its horns, twists itself round and round upon them until they are worn off, and then falls down and expires. Footnote: Tschudi's Sketches of Nature in the Alps. End footnote. Even Tschudi himself calls this story wonderful. He may well do so. I disclaim belief in it. The bouquetin is too fine a beast to indulge in such antics. 45 keepers, selected from the most able chasseurs of the district, guard its haunts. Their task is not a light one, although they are naturally acquainted with those who are most likely to attempt poaching. If they were withdrawn, it would not be long before the ibex would be an extinct wild animal, so far as the Alps are concerned. The passion for killing something, and the present value of the beast itself, would soon lead to extermination. For as meat alone, the bouquetin is valuable, the gross weight of one that is full grown amounting from 160 to 200 pounds, while its skin and horns are worth 10 pounds and upward, according to condition and dimensions. In spite of the keepers, and of the severe penalties which may be inflicted for killing a bouquetin, poaching occurs constantly. Knowing that this was the case, I inquired at Aosta, upon my last visit, if any skins or horns were for sale, and in 10 minutes was taken into a garret where the remains of a splendid beast were concealed, a magnificent male, presumed to be more than 20 years old, as its massive horns had 22 more or less strongly marked knobby rings. The extreme length of the skin, from the tip of the nose to the end of the tail, was 1 metre 69 centimetres, about 5 feet 7 inches, and from the ground to the top of its back had been apparently about 77 centimetres. It is rare to meet with a bouquetin of these dimensions, and the owner of this skin might have been visited with several years' imprisonment if it had been known that it was in his possession. The chase of the bouquetin is properly considered a sport fit for a king, and His Majesty Victor Emmanuel, for whom it is reserved, is too good a sportsman to slaughter indiscriminately an animal which is an ornament to his domains. Last year, 1869, 17 fell to his gun at 100 yards and upward. In 1868 His Majesty presented a fine specimen to the Italian Alpine Club. The members banqueted, I believe, upon its flesh, and they have had the skin stuffed and set up in their rooms at Aosta. It is said by connoisseurs to be badly stuffed, that it is not broad enough in the chest and is too large behind. Still, it looks well proportioned, although it seems made for hard work rather than for feats of agility. From this specimen the accompanying engraving has been made. It is a full-grown male, about 12 years old, and if stood upright would measure 3 feet 3½ inches from the ground to the base of its horns. Its extreme length is 4 feet 7 inches. Its horns have 11 well-marked rings, besides 1 or 2 faintly marked ones, and are, measured round their curvature, 54½ centimetres in length. The horns of the first-mentioned specimen, measured in the same way, had a length of only 53½ centimetres, although they were ornamented with nearly double the number of rings, and were presumably of double the age of the other. Footnote. Mr. King, in his Italian Valleys of the Alps, says, "In the pair of horns I possess, which are 2 feet long, there are 8 of these yearly rings." It would seem, therefore, if the rings are annual ones, that the maximum length of horn is attained at a comparatively early age. End of footnote. The keepers and the chasseurs of this district not only say that the rings upon the horns of the ibex tell its age, each one reckoning as a year, but that the half-developed ones, which sometimes are very feebly marked indeed, show that the animal has suffered from hunger during the winter. Naturalists are sceptical upon this point, but inasmuch as they offer no better reason against the reputed fact than the natives do in its favor, one saying that it is not so, and the other saying that it is so, we may be perhaps permitted to consider it as an open question. I can only say that if the faintly marked rings do denote years of famine, the times for the bouquetin are very hard indeed, since in most of the horns which I have seen, the lesser rings have been very numerous, and sometimes more plentiful than the prominent ones. The chef of the keepers, who judges by the above-mentioned indications, tells me that the ibex not unfrequently arrives at the age of 30 years, and sometimes to 40 or 45. He says, too, that it is not fond of traversing steep snow, and in descending a couloir that is filled with it, it will zigzag down by springing from one side to the other in leaps of 50 feet at a time. Jean Tailraz, the worthy landlord of the Hôtel du Mont Blanc at Aosta, who has had opportunities of observing the animal closely, assures me that at the age of 4 or 5 months it can easily clear a height of 9 or 10 feet at a bound. Long live the bouquetin, and long may its chase preserve the health of the mountaineering king, Victor Emmanuel. Long live the bouquetin, but down with the cretin. The peculiar form of idiocy which is called cretinism is so highly developed in the valley of Aosta, and the natives are so familiarized with it, that they are almost indignant when the surprised traveler remarks its frequency. One is continually reminded that it is not peculiar to the valley, and that there are cretins elsewhere. It is too true that this terrible scourge is widespread throughout the Alps and over the world, and that there are places where the proportion of cretins to population is, or has been, even greater than in the valley of Aosta. But I have never seen or heard of a valley so fertile and so charming, of one which, apart from cretinism, leaves so agreeable an impression on the wayfarer, where equal numbers are reduced to a condition which any respectable ape might despise. The whole subject of cretinism is surrounded with difficulty. The number of those who are afflicted by it is unknown, its cure is doubtful, and its origin is mysterious. It has puzzled the most acute observers, and every general statement in regard to it must be fenced by qualifications. It is tolerably certain, however, that the center of its distribution in the valley of Aosta is about the center of the valley. The city of Aosta itself may be regarded as its headquarters. It is there, and in the neighboring towns of Gignot, Villeneuve, Saint-Vincent, and Verret, and in the villages and upon the high road between those places, that these distorted, mindless beings, more like brutes than men, commonly excite one's disgust by their hideous, loathsome, and uncouth appearance, by their obscene gestures, and by their senseless gabbling. The accompanying portrait of one is by no means overdrawn. Some are too frightful for representation. How can we account for this particular intensity toward the middle of the valley? Why is it that cretins become more and more numerous after Ivrea is passed, attain their highest ratio and lowest degradation at or about the chief town of the valley, and then diminish in numbers as its upper termination is approached? This maximum of intensity must certainly point to a cause, or to a combination of causes operating about Aosta, which are less powerful at the two extremities of the valley, and if the reason for it could be determined, the springs of cretinism would be exposed. The disease would be even more puzzling than it is if it were confined to this single locality, and the inquirer were to find not merely that it was almost unknown upon the plains to the east and in the districts to the west, but that the valleys radiating north and south from the main valley were practically unaffected by it. For it is a remarkable circumstance, which has attracted the notice of all who have paid attention to cretinism, that the natives of the tributary valleys are almost free from the malady, that people of the same race, speaking the same language, breathing the same air, eating the same food, and living the same life, enjoy almost entire immunity from it, while at the distance of a very few miles, thousands of others are completely in its power. A parallel case is found, however, on the other side of the Pennine Alps. The Rhone Valley is almost equally disfigured by cretinism, and in it too the extremities of the valley are slightly affected compared with the intermediate districts, particularly those between Brigue and Saint-Maurice. Footnote: It was stated a few years ago that 1 in 25 of the natives of the Canton Valais, which is chiefly occupied by the valley of the Upper Rhone, were cretins. This would give about 3,500 to the canton. At the same time, the valley of Aosta contained about 2,000 cretins. End footnote. This second example strengthens the conviction that the great development of cretinism in the middle of the valley of Aosta is not the result of accidental circumstances. It was formerly supposed that cretinism arose from the habitual drinking of snow and glacier water. De Saussure opposed to this conjecture the facts that the disease was entirely unknown precisely in those places where the inhabitants were most dependent upon these kinds of water, and that it was most common where such was not the case, that the high valleys were untainted while the low ones were infected. The notion seems to have proceeded from cretins being confounded with persons who were merely goitered, or at least from the supposition that goiter was an incipient stage of cretinism. Goiter, it is now well ascertained, is induced by the use of chemically impure water, and especially hard water, and the investigations of various observers have discovered that goiter has an intimate connection with certain geological formations. In harmony with these facts, it is found that infants are seldom born with goiters, but that they develop as the child grows up, that they will sometimes appear and disappear from mere change of locality, and that it is possible to produce them intentionally. It is not so certain that the causes which produce goiter should be regarded as causes of the production or maintenance of cretinism. It is true that cretins are very generally goiterous, but it is also true that there are tens of thousands of goitrous persons who are entirely free from all traces of cretinism. Not only so, but that there are districts in the Alps, and outside of them, even in our own country, where goiter is not rare, but where the cretin is unknown. Still, regarding the evil state of the body which leads to goiter as being possibly in alliance with cretinism, it will not be irrelevant to give the former disease a little more attention before continuing the consideration of the main subject. In this country, the possession of a goiter is considered a misfortune rather than otherwise, and individuals who are afflicted with these appendages attempt to conceal their shame. In the Alps it is quite the reverse. In France, Italy, and Switzerland, it is a positive advantage to be goitered, as it secures exemption from military service. A goiter is a thing to be prized, exhibited, preserved. It is worth so much hard cash, and it is an unquestionable fact that the perpetuation of the great goitrous family is assisted by this very circumstance. When Savoy was annexed to France, the administration took stock of the resources of its new territory, and soon discovered that although the acres were many, the conscripts would be few. The government bestirred itself to amend this state of affairs, and after arriving at the conclusion that goiter was produced by drinking bad water, and that its production was promoted by sottish and bestial habits, took measures to cleanse the villages, to analyze the waters, in order to point out those which should not be drunk, and to give to children who came to school lozenges containing small doses of iodine. It is said that out of 5,000 goitrous children who were so treated in the course of 8 years, 2,000 were cured, and the condition of 2,000 others was improved, and that the number of cures would have been greater if the parents had not opposed to the care of the government in order to preserve the privilege of exemption from military service. These benighted creatures refused the marshal's baton and preferred their wallets of flesh. No wonder that the préfet for Haute-Savoie proposes that goitrous persons shall no longer be privileged. Let him go farther, and obtain a decree that all of them capable of bearing arms shall be immediately drafted into the army. Let them be formed into regiments by themselves, brigaded together, and commanded by cretins. Think what esprit de corps they would have! Who could stand against them? Who would understand their tactics? He would save his iodine, and would render an act of justice to the non-goitered population. The subject is worthy of serious attention. If goiter is really an ally of cretinism, the sooner it is eradicated, the better. De Saussure substituted heat and stagnation of air as the cause of cretinism in the place of badness of water. But this was only giving up one unsatisfactory explanation for another equally untenable. And since there are places far hotter and with pernicious atmospheres where the disease is unknown, while on the other hand there are situations in which it is common where the heat is not excessive and which enjoy a freely circulating atmosphere, his assumption may be set aside as insufficient to account for the cretinism of the valley of Aosta. And in regard to its particular case, it may be questioned whether there is anything more than an imaginary stagnation of air. For my own part, I attribute the oppression which strangers say they feel in the middle of the valley, not to stagnation of air, but to absence of shadow in consequence of the valley's course being east and west, and believe that if the force of the wind were observed and estimated according to the methods in common use, it would be found that there is no deficiency of motion in the air throughout the entire year. Several towns and villages, moreover, where cretins are most numerous, are placed at the entrances of valleys and upon elevated slopes, with abundant natural facilities for drainage, free from malaria, which has been suggested as accounting for the cretinism of the Rhone valley. Others have imagined that intemperance, poor living, foul habits, and personal uncleanliness sow the seeds of cretinism, and this opinion is entitled to full consideration. Intemperance of divers kinds is fruitful in the production of insanity, and herding together in filthy dwellings, with little or no ventilation, may possibly deteriorate physique as much as extreme indulgence may the mind. These ideas are popularly entertained, because cretins are more numerous among the lower orders than among the well-to-do classes. Yet they must, each and all, be regarded as inadequate to account for the disease, still less to explain its excess in the center of the valley, for in these respects there is little or no distinction between it, the two extremities, and the neighboring districts. A conjecture remains to be considered regarding the origin of cretinism which is floating in the minds of many persons, although it is seldom expressed, which carries with it an air of probability that is wanting in the other explanations, and which is supported by admitted facts. The fertility of the valley of Aosta is proverbial. It is covered with vineyards and cornfields, flocks and herds abound in it, and its mineral resources are great. There is enough and to spare, both for man and beast. There are poor in the valley, as there are everywhere, but life is so far easy that they are not driven to seek for subsistence in other places, and remain from generation to generation rooted to their native soil. The large numbers of persons who are found in this valley having the same surnames is a proof of the well-known fact that there is little or no emigration from the valley, and that there is an indefinite amount of intermarriage between the natives. It is conjectured that the continuance of these conditions through a long period has rendered the population more or less consanguineous, and that we see in cretinism an example, upon a large scale, of the evil effects of alliances of kindred. This explanation commends itself by reason of its general applicability to cretinism. The disease is commonly found in valleys, on islands, or in other circumscribed areas in which circulation is restricted or the inhabitants are non-migratory, and it is rare on plains where communications are free. It will at once be asked, why then are not the tributary valleys of the valley of Aosta full of cretins? The answer is that these lateral valleys are comparatively sterile, and are unable to support their population from their internal resources. Large numbers annually leave and do not return. Some come back, having formed alliances elsewhere. There is a constant circulation and introduction of new blood. I am not aware that there are returns to show the extent to which this goes on, but the fact is notorious. This conjecture explains, far better than the other guesses, why it is that cretinism has so strong a hold upon the lower classes, while it leaves the upper ones almost untouched. For the former are most likely to intermarry with people of their own district, whilst the latter are under no sort of compulsion in this respect. It gives a clue, too, to the reason of the particular intensity in the centre of the valley. The inhabitants of the lower extremity communicate and mix with the untainted dwellers on the plains, whilst the conditions at the upper extremity approximate to those of the lateral valleys. Before this explanation will be generally received, a closer connection will have to be established between the assumed cause and the presumed effect. Accepting it, nevertheless, as a probable and reasonable one, let us now consider what prospect there is of checking the progress of the disease. It is, of course, impossible to change the habits of the natives of the valley of Aosta suddenly, and it would probably be very difficult to cause any large amount of emigration or immigration. In the present embarrassed condition of Italian finances, there is very small chance of any measure of the sort being undertaken if it would involve a considerable expenditure. The opening of a railway from Ivrea to Aosta might possibly bring about, in a natural way, more movement than would be promoted by any legislation, and by this means the happiest effects might be produced. There is little hope of practical results from attempts to cure cretins. Once a cretin, you are always one. The experiments of the late Dr. Guggenbühl demonstrated that some half-cretins may even become useful members of society if they are taken in hand early in life, but they did not show that the nature of the true or complete cretin could be altered. He essayed to modify some of the mildest forms of cretinism, but did not strike at the root of the evil. If 50 Guggenbühls were at work in the single valley of Aosta, they would take several generations to produce an appreciable effect, and they would never extirpate the disease so long as its sources were unassailed. Nor will the house which has been built at Aosta to contain 200 cretin beggars do much, unless the inmates are restrained from perpetuating their own degradation. Even the lowest types of cretins may be procreative, and it is said that the unlimited liberty which is allowed to them has caused infinite mischief. A large proportion of the cretins who will be born in the next generation will undoubtedly be offspring of cretin parents. It is strange that self-interest does not lead the natives of Aosta to place their cretins under such restrictions as would prevent their illicit intercourse, and it is still more surprising to find the Catholic Church actually legalizing their marriage. There is something horribly grotesque in the idea of solemnizing the union of a brace of idiots, and since it is well known that the disease is hereditary and develops in successive generations, the fact that such marriages are sanctioned is scandalous and infamous. The supply, therefore, is kept up from two sources. The first contingent is derived from apparently healthy parents, the second by inheritance from diseased persons. The origin of the first is obscure, and before its quota can be cut off or even diminished, the mystery which envelops it must be dissipated. The remedy for the second is obvious, and is in the hands of the authorities, particularly in those of the clergy. Marriage must be prohibited to all who are affected, the most extreme cases must be placed under restraint, and cretins whose origin is illegitimate must be subject to disabilities. Nothing short of the adoption of these measures will meet the case. Useless it will be, so long as the primary sources of the disease are untouched, to build hospitals, to cleanse dwellings, to widen streets, or to attempt small ameliorations of the social circumstances of the natives. All of these things are good enough in themselves, but they are wholly impotent to effect a radical change. No satisfactory conclusion will be arrived at regarding the origin of cretinism until the pedigrees of a large number of examples have been traced. The numerical test is the only one which is likely to discover the reality. The necessary inquiries are beyond the powers of private persons, and their pursuit will be found sufficiently difficult by official investigators. Great reluctance will be exhibited to disclose the information which should be sought, and the common cry will certainly be raised that such scrutiny is without general advantage and is painful to private feelings. But in matters which affect mankind in general, individual feelings must always be subordinated to the public interest, and if the truth is to be arrived at in regard to cretinism, the protests of the ignorant will have to be overridden. Cretinism is the least agreeable feature of the valley of Aosta, but it is at the same time the most striking. It has been touched upon for the sake of its human interest, and on account of those unhappy beings who, punished by the errors of their fathers, are powerless to help themselves. The first sight of whom produced such an impression upon the most earnest of all Alpine writers, that he declared, in a twice repeated expression, its recollection would never be effaced from his memory. On the 23rd of June, 1865, my guides and I were reposing upon the top of Mont Saxe, scanning the Grand Jorasses with a view to ascending it. 5,000 feet of glacier-covered precipices rose above us, and up all that height we tracked away to our satisfaction. 3,000 feet more of glacier and forest-covered slopes lay beneath, and there was only one point at which it was doubtful if we should find a path. The glaciers were shrinking, and were surrounded by bastions of rounded rock, far too polished to please the rough mountaineer. We could not track a way across them. However, at 4 a.m. the next day, under the dexterous leading of Michel Croz, we passed the same spot. Thence it was all plain sailing, and at 1 p.m. we gained the summit. The weather was boisterous in the upper regions, and storm clouds driven before the wind and wrecked against our heights enveloped us in misty spray, which danced around and fled away, which cut us off from the material universe and caused us to be, as it were, suspended betwixt heaven and earth, seeing both occasionally, but seeming to belong to neither. The mists lasted longer than my patience, and we descended without having attained the object for which the ascent was made. At first we followed the little ridge shown upon the accompanying engraving, the Grand Jorasses from the Val Ferret, leading from our summit toward the spectator, and then took the head of the corridor of the glacier on its left, which in the view is left perfectly white. The slopes were steep and covered with new fallen snow, flower-like and evil to tread upon. On the ascent we had reviled it, and had made our staircase with much caution, knowing full well that the disturbance of its base would bring down all that was above. In descending, the bolder spirits counselled trusting to luck and a glissade. The cautious ones advocated avoiding the slopes and crossing to the rocks on the farther side. The advice of the latter prevailed, and we had half traversed the snow to gain the ridge when the crust slipped and we went along with it. "Halt!" broke from all four unanimously. The axe heads flew round as we started on this involuntary glissade. It was useless. They slid over the underlying ice fruitlessly. "Halt!" thundered Croz, as he dashed his weapon in again with superhuman energy. No halt could be made, and we slid down slowly, but with accelerating motion, driving up waves of snow in front, with streams of the nasty stuff hissing all around. Luckily, the slope eased off at one place, the leading men cleverly jumped aside out of the moving snow, we others followed, and the young avalanche, which we had started, continued to pour down, fell into a yawning crevasse, and showed us where our grave would have been if we had remained in its company 5 seconds longer. The whole affair did not occupy half a minute. It was the solitary incident of a long day, and at nightfall we re-entered the excellent house kept by the courteous Bertolini, well satisfied that we had not met with more incidents of a similar description. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, the Col Dolent. Free-thinking mountaineers have been latterly in the habit of going up one side of an Alp and coming down the other and calling the route a pass. In this confusion of ideas may be recognized the result of the looseness of thought which arises from the absence of technical education. The true believer abhors such heresies, and observes with satisfaction that Providence oftentimes punishes the offenders for their greediness by causing them to be benighted. The faithful know that passes must be made between mountains and not over their tops. Their creed declares that between any two mountains there must be a pass, and they believe that the end for which big peaks were created, the office they are especially designed to fulfill, is to point out the way one should go. This is the true faith, and there is no other. We set out upon the 26th of June to endeavour to add one more to the passes which are strictly orthodox. We hoped, rather than expected, to discover a quicker route from Courmayeur to Chamonix than the Col du Géant, which was the easiest, quickest, and most direct pass known at the time across the main chain of Mont Blanc. The misgivings which I had as to the result caused us to start at the unusual hour of 12:40 a.m. At 4:30 we passed the chalets of Près du Bar, and thence for some distance followed the track which we had made upon the ascent of Mont Dolent over the glacier of the same name. At 8:15 we arrived at the head of the glacier and at the foot of the only steep gradient upon the whole of the ascent. It was the beau ideal of a pass. There was a gap in the mountains, with a big peak on each side, Mont Dolent and the Aiguille du Triolet. A narrow thread of snow led up to the lowest point between those mountains, and the blue sky beyond said, "Directly you arrive here you will begin to go down." We addressed ourselves to our task, and at 10:15 a.m. arrived at the top of the pass. Had things gone as they ought, within 6 hours more we should have been at Chamonix. Upon the other side we knew that there was a couloir in correspondence with that up which we had just come. If it had been filled with snow, all would have been well. It turned out to be filled with ice. Croz, who led, passed over to the other side and reported that we should get down somehow, but I knew from the sound of his axe how the somehow would be, and settled myself to sketch, well assured that I should not be wanted for an hour to come. What I saw is shown in the engraving. A sharp aiguille, nameless, perhaps the sharpest in the whole range, backed on the left by the Aiguille de Triolet, queer blocks of probably protogine sticking out awkwardly through the snow, and a huge cornice from which big icicles depended, that broke away occasionally and went skiddling down the slope up which we had come. Of the Argentière side I could not see anything. Croz was tied up with our good manila rope, and the whole 200 feet were paid out gradually by Alma and Bina before he ceased working. After 2 hours' incessant toil, he was able to anchor himself to the rock on his right. He then untied himself, the rope was drawn in, Bina was attached to the end and went down to join his comrade. There was then room enough for me to stand by the side of Alma, and I got my first view of the other side. For the first and only time in my life, I looked down a slope of more than 1,000 feet long, set at an angle of about 50 degrees, which was a sheet of ice from top to bottom. It was unbroken by rock or crag, and anything thrown down it sped away unarrested until the level of the Glacier d'Argentière was reached. The entire basin of that noble glacier was spread out at our feet, and the ridge beyond, culminating in the Aiguille d'Argentière, was seen to the greatest advantage. I confess, however, that I paid very little attention to the view, for there was no time to indulge in such luxuries. I descended the icy staircase and joined the others, and then we three drew in the rope tenderly as Alma came down. His was not an enviable position, but he descended with as much steadiness as if his whole life had been passed on ice slopes of 50 degrees. The process was repeated, Croz again going to the front, and availing himself very skillfully of the rocks which projected from the cliff on our right. Our 200 feet of rope again came to an end, and we again descended one by one. From this point we were able to clamber down by the rocks alone for about 300 feet. They then became sheer cliff, and we stopped for dinner, about 2:30 p.m., at the last place upon which we could sit. 4 hours' incessant work had brought us rather more than halfway down the gully. We were now approaching, although we were still high above the schrunds at its base, and the guides made out, in some way unknown to me, that nature had perversely placed the only snow bridge across the topmost one toward the center of the gully. It was decided to cut diagonally across the gully to the point where the snow bridge was supposed to be. Alma and Bina undertook the work, leaving Croz and myself firmly planted on the rocks to pay out rope to them as they advanced. It is generally admitted that veritable ice slopes, understanding by ice something more than a crust of hard snow over soft snow, are only rarely met with in the Alps. They are frequently spoken of, but such as that to which I refer are very rarely seen, and still more seldom traversed. It is, however, always possible that they may be encountered, and on this account, if for no other, it is necessary for men who go mountaineering to be armed with ice axes and with good ones. The form is of more importance than might be supposed. Of course, if you intend to act as a simple amateur and let others do the work, and only follow in their steps, it is not of much importance what kind of an ice axe you carry, so long as its head does not fall off or otherwise behave itself improperly. There is no better weapon for cutting steps in ice than a common pickaxe, and the form of ice axe which is now usually employed by the best guides is very like a miniature pick. My own axe is copied from Melchior Andereg's. It is of wrought iron, with point and edge steeled. Its weight, including spiked handle, is 4 pounds. For cutting steps in ice, the pointed end of the head is almost exclusively employed. The adze end is handy for polishing them up, but it is principally used for cutting in hard snow. Apart from its value as a cutting weapon, it is invaluable as a grapnel. It is naturally a rather awkward implement when it is not being employed for its legitimate purpose, and is likely to give rise to much strong language in crushes at railway termini, unless its head is protected with a leathern cap or in some other way. Many attempts have been made, for the sake of convenience, to fashion an ice axe with a movable head, but it seems difficult or impossible to produce one except at the expense of cutting qualities and by increasing the weight. Mr. T. S. Kennedy, of the firm of Fairbairn and Company, whose practical acquaintance with mountaineering and with the use and manufacture of tools makes his opinion particularly valuable, has contrived the best that I have seen, but even it seems to me to be deficient in rigidity, and not to be so powerful a weapon as the more common kind with the fixed head. The simple instrument which is shown in the annexed diagram is the invention of Mr. Leslie Stephen, and it answers the purposes for which he devised it, namely, for giving better hold upon snow and ice than can be obtained from the common alpenstock, and for cutting an occasional step. The amateur scarcely requires anything more imposing, but for serious ice work a heavier weapon is indispensable. To persons armed with the proper tools, ice slopes are not so dangerous as many places which appeal less to the imagination. Their ascent or descent is necessarily laborious to those who do the work, and they may therefore be termed difficult. They ought not to be dangerous. Yet they always seem dangerous, for one is profoundly convinced that if he slips, he will certainly go to the bottom. Hence, any man who is not a fool takes particular care to preserve his balance, and in consequence we have the noteworthy fact that accidents have seldom or never taken place upon ice slopes. The same slopes covered with snow are much less impressive, and may be much more dangerous. They may be less slippery, the balance may be more easily preserved, and if one man slips he may be stopped by his own personal efforts, provided the snow which overlies the ice is consolidated and of a reasonable depth. But if, as is more likely to be the case upon an angle of 50 degrees, or anything approaching that angle, there is only a thin stratum of snow which is not consolidated, the occurrence of a slip will most likely take the entire party as low as possible, and in addition to the chance of broken necks, there will be a strong probability that some, at least, will be smothered by the dislodged snow. Such accidents are far too common, and their occurrence, as a rule, may be traced to the want of caution which is induced by the apparent absence of danger. I do not believe that the use of the rope in the ordinary way affords the least real security upon ice slopes, nor do I think that any benefit is derived from the employment of crampons. Mr. Kennedy was good enough to present me with a pair some time ago, and one of these has been engraved. They are the best variety I have seen of the species, but I only feel comfortable with them on my feet in places where they are not of the slightest use, that is, in situations where there is no possibility of slipping, and would not wear them upon an ice slope for any consideration whatever. All such adventitious aids are useless if you have not a good step in the ice to stand upon, and if you have got that, nothing more is wanted except a few nails in the boots. Almer and Biener got to the end of their tether. The rope no longer assured their safety, and they stopped work as we advanced and coiled it up. Shortly afterward they struck a streak of snow that proved to be just above the bridge of which they were in search. The slope steepened, and for 30 feet or so we descended face to the wall, making steps by kicking with the toes and thrusting the arms well into the holes above, just as if they had been rounds in a ladder. At this time we were crossing the uppermost of the schrunds. Needless to say that the snow was of an admirable quality. This performance would otherwise have been impossible. It was soon over, and we then found ourselves upon a huge rhomboidal mass of ice, and still separated from the Argentière glacier by a gigantic crevasse. The only bridge over this lower schrund was at its eastern end, and we were obliged to double back to get to it. Cutting continued for half an hour after it was passed, and it was 5:35 p.m. before the axes stopped work, and we could at last turn back and look comfortably at the formidable slope upon which 7 hours had been spent. Footnote: I estimate its height at 1,200 feet. The triangulation of Captain Mullet places the summit of the pass 11,624 feet above the sea. This, I think, is too high. End footnote. The Col Dolent is not likely to compete with the Col du Géant, and I would recommend any person who starts to cross it to allow himself plenty of time, plenty of rope, and ample guide power. There is no difficulty whatever upon any part of the route. excepting upon the steep slopes immediately below the summit on each side. When we arrived upon the Glacier d'Argentière, our work was as good as over. We drove a straight track to the chalet of Lognan, and thence the way led over familiar ground. Soon after dusk we got in the high road at Les Tines, and at 10 p.m. arrived at Chamonix. Our labors were duly rewarded. Houris brought us champagne and the other drinks which are reserved for the faithful, but before my share was consumed I fell asleep in an armchair. I slept soundly until daybreak, and then turned into bed and went to sleep again. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Ascent of the Aiguille Verte. Michel Croz now parted from us. His new employer had not arrived at Chamonix, but Croz considered that he was bound by honor to wait for him, and thus Christian Alme of Grindelwald became my leading guide. Alme displayed aptitude for mountaineering at an early age. Whilst still a very young man, he was known as a crack chamois hunter, and he soon developed into an accomplished guide. Those who have read Mr. Will's graphic account of the first ascent of the Matterhorn will remember that when his party was approaching the top of the mountain, two stranger men were seen climbing by a slightly different route, one of whom carried upon his back a young fir tree, branches, leaves, and all. Mr. Wills's guides were extremely indignant with these two strangers, who were evidently determined to be the first at the summit, and talked of giving them blows. Eventually they gave them a cake of chocolate instead, and declared that they were good fellows. Thus the pipe of peace was smoked, and tranquillity reigned between the rival forces. Christian Almer was one of these two men. This was in 1854. In 1858–59 he made the first ascents of the Aiguille and the Mönch, the former with a Mr. Harrington, and the latter with a Dr. Porge. Since then he has wandered far and near, from Dauphiné to the Tyrol. With the exception of Melchior Anderegg, there is not perhaps another guide of such wide experience, or one who has been so invariably successful, and his numerous employers concur in saying that there is not a truer heart or a surer foot to be found amongst the Alps. Before recrossing the chain to Courmayeur, we ascended the Aiguille Verte. In company with Mr. Riley, I inspected this mountain from every direction in 1864, and came to the conclusion that an ascent could be more easily made from the south than upon any other side. We set out upon the 28th from Chamonix to attack it, minus Croz, and plus a porter, of whom I will speak more particularly presently, leaving our comrade very downcast at having to kick his heels in idleness while we were about to scale the most celebrated of his native aiguilles. Our course led us over the old Mer de Glace, the glacier made famous by de Saussure and Forbes. The heat of the day was over, but the little rills and rivulets were still flowing along the surface of the ice, cutting deep troughs where the gradients were small, leaving ripple marks where the water was with more difficulty confined to one channel, and falling over the precipitous walls of the great crevasses, sometimes in bounding cascades, and sometimes in diffused streams which marked the perpendicular faces with graceful sinuosities. As night came on, their music died away, the rivulets dwindled down to rills, the rills ceased to murmur, and the sparkling drops, caught by the hand of frost, were bound to the ice, coating it with an enamelled film which lasted until the sun struck the glacier once more. The weathering of the walls of crevasses, which obscures the internal structure of the glacier, has led some to conclude that the stratification which is seen in the higher glacier regions is obliterated in the lower ones. Others, Agassiz and Mr. John Ball, for example, have disputed this opinion, and my own experiences accord with those of these accurate observers. It is undoubtedly very difficult to trace stratification in the lower ends of the Alpine glaciers, but we are not, upon that account, entitled to conclude that the original structure of the ice has been obliterated. There are thousands of crevasses in the upper regions upon whose walls no traces of bedding are apparent, and we might say with equal unreasonableness that it was obliterated there also. Take an axe and clear away the ice which has been formed from water trickling down the faces and the weathered ice beneath, and you will expose sections of the mingled strata of pure and imperfect ice, and see clearly enough that the primitive structure of the glacier has not been effaced, although it has been obscured. We camped on the Couvercle, 7,800 feet, under a great rock, and at 3:15 the next morning started for our Aiguille, leaving the porter in charge of the tent and of the food. 2 hours walking over crisp snow brought us up more than 4,000 feet, and within about 1,600 feet of the summit. From no other direction can it be approached so closely with equal facility. Thence the mountain steepens. After his late severe piece of ice work, Aimer had a natural inclination for rocks, but the lower rocks of the final peak of the Verte were not inviting, and he went on, looking for a way up them, until we arrived in front of a great snow couloir that led from the Glacier de Talèfre right up to the crest of the ridge connecting the summit of the Verte with the mountain called Les Droites. This was the route which I intended to be taken, but Aimer pointed out that the gully narrowed at the lower part, and that if stones fell we should stand some chance of getting our heads broken. And so we went on still more to the east of the summit, to another and smaller couloir, which ran up side by side with the great one. At 5:30 we crossed the schrund, which protected the final peak, and a few minutes afterward saw the summit and the whole of the intervening route. "Oh, Aiguille Verte," said my guide, stopping as he said it, "you are dead, you are dead," which being translated into plain English means that he was cocksure we should make the ascent. Aimer is a quiet man at all times. When climbing he is taciturn, and this is one of his great merits. A garrulous man is always a nuisance, and upon the mountain side he may be a danger, for actual climbing requires a man's whole attention. Added to this, talkative men are hindrances. They are usually thirsty, and a thirsty man is a drag. Guidebooks recommend mountain walkers to suck pebbles to prevent their throats from becoming parched. There is not much goodness to be got out of these pebbles, but you cannot suck them and keep the mouth open at the same time, and hence the throat does not become dry. It answers just as well to keep the mouth shut, without any pebbles inside. Indeed, I think better, for if you have occasion to open your mouth, you can do so without swallowing any pebbles. Footnote: I heard lately of two well-known mountaineers who, under the influence of sudden alarm, swallowed their crystals. I am happy to say that they were able to cough them up again. End of footnote. As a rule, amateurs, and particularly novices, will not keep their mouths shut. They attempt to force the pace, they go faster than they can go without being compelled to open their mouths to breathe, they pant, their throats and tongues become parched, they drink and perspire copiously, and becoming exhausted declare that the dryness of the air, or the rarefaction of the air (everything is laid upon the air), is in fault. On several accounts, therefore, a mountain climber does well to hold his tongue while he is at his work. At the top of the small gully we crossed over the intervening rocks into the larger one, and followed it so long as it was filled with snow. At last ice replaced snow, and we turned over to the rocks upon its left. Charming rocks they were, granitic in texture, gritty, holding the nails well. At 9:45 we parted from them, and completed the ascent by a little ridge of snow, which descended in the direction of the Aiguille du Moine. At 10:15 we stood on the summit, 13,540 feet, and devoured our bread and cheese with a good appetite. I have already spoken of the disappointing nature of purely panoramic views. That seen from Mont Blanc itself is notoriously unsatisfactory. When you are upon that summit you look down upon all the rest of Europe. There is nothing to look up to. All is below. There is no one point for the eye to rest upon. The man who is there is somewhat in the position of one who has attained all that he desires. He has nothing to aspire to. His position must needs be unsatisfactory. Upon the summit of the Verte there is not this objection. You see valleys, villages, fields. You see mountains interminable rolling away, lakes resting in their hollows. You hear the tinkling of the sheep bells as it rises through the clear mountain air, and the roar of the avalanches as they descend to the valleys. But above all, there is the great white dome, with its shining crest high above, with its sparkling glaciers that descend between buttresses which support them, with its brilliant snows, purer and yet purer the farther they are removed from this unclean world. Even upon this mountain top it was impossible to forget the world, for some vile wretch came to the jardin and made hideous sounds by blowing upon a horn. Whilst we were denouncing him, a change came over the weather. Cumulus clouds gathered in all directions, and we started off in hot haste. Snow began to fall heavily before we were off the summit rocks. Our track was obscured and frequently lost, and everything became so sloppy and slippery that the descent took as long as the ascent. The schrund was recrossed at 3:15 p.m., and thence we raced down to the Couvercle, intending to have a carouse there. But as we rounded our rock a howl broke simultaneously from all three of us, for the porter had taken down the tent and was in the act of moving off with it. "Stop there! What are you doing?" He observed that he thought we were killed, or at least lost, and was going to Chamonix to communicate his ideas to the guide chef. "Unfasten the tent and get out the food." But instead of doing so, the porter fumbled in his pockets. "Get out the food!" we roared, losing all patience. "Here it is," said our worthy friend, producing a dirty piece of bread about as big as a halfpenny roll. We three looked solemnly at the fluff-covered morsel. It was past a joke. He had devoured everything. Mutton, loaves, cheese, wine, eggs, sausages, all was gone past recovery. It was idle to grumble and useless to wait. We were light and could move quickly. The porter was laden inside out. We went our hardest. He had to shuffle and trot. He streamed with perspiration. The mutton and cheese oozed out in big drops. He larded the glacier. We had our revenge and dried our clothes at the same time, but when we arrived at the Montanvert, the porter was as wet as we had been upon our arrival at the Couvercle. We halted at the inn to get a little food, and at 8:15 re-entered Chamonix amidst firing of cannon and other demonstrations of satisfaction on the part of the hotel keepers. One would have thought that the ascent of this mountain, which had been frequently assailed before without success, would have afforded some gratification to a population whose chief support is derived from tourists, and that the prospect of the perennial flow of francs which might be expected to result from it would have stifled the jealousy consequent on the success of foreigners. Footnote: the Chamonix tariff price for the ascent of the Aiguille is now placed at £4 per guide. End footnote. It was not so. Chamonix stood on its rights. A stranger had ignored their regulations, had imported 2 foreign guides, and furthermore he had added injury to that insult. He had not taken a single Chamonix guide. Chamonix would be revenged. It would bully the foreign guides. It would tell them they had lied. They had not made the ascent. Where were their proofs? Where was the flag upon the summit? Poor Alma and Biener were accordingly chivied from pillar to post, from one inn to another, and at length complained to me. Peter Perren, the Zermatt guide, said on the night that we returned that this was to happen, but the story seemed too absurd to be true. I now bade my men go out again, and followed them myself to see the sport. Chamonix was greatly excited. The bureau of the guide chef was thronged with clamoring men. Their ringleader, one Zachary Cachat, a well-known guide of no particular merit, but not a bad fellow, was haranguing the multitude. He met with more than his match. My friend Kennedy, who was on the spot, heard of the disturbance, and rushed into the fray, confronted the burly guide, and thrust back his absurdities into his teeth. There were the materials for a very pretty riot, but they manage these things better in France than we do, and the gendarmes, 3 strong, came down and dispersed the crowd. The guides quailed before the cocked hats, and retired to cabarets to take little glasses of absinthe and other liquors more or less injurious to the human frame. Under the influence of these stimulants, they conceived an idea which combined revenge with profit. You have ascended the Aiguille Verte, you say. We say we don't believe it. We say do it again. Take 3 of us with you, and we will bet you 2,000 francs to 1,000 that you won't make the ascent. This proposition was formally notified to me, but I declined it with thanks, and recommended Kennedy to go in and win. I accepted, however, 100 francs share in the bet, and calculated upon getting 200% on my investment. Alas, how vain are human expectations! Zachary Cachat was put into confinement, and although Kennedy actually ascended the Aiguille a week later with 2 Chamonix guides and Peter Perrin, the bet came to nothing. Footnote: It should be said that we received the most polite apologies for this affair from the chief of the gendarmes, and an invitation to lodge a complaint against the ringleaders. We accepted his apologies and declined his invitation. Needless to say, Michel Croz took no part in the demonstration. End of footnote. The weather arranged itself just as this storm in a teapot blew over, and we left at once for the Montanvert in order to show the Chamoniards the easiest way over the chain of Mont Blanc in return for the civilities which we had received from them during the past 3 days. End of chapter 18. Part 10, Chapter 19 of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, the Col de Talèfre. The person who discovered the Col du Géant must have been a shrewd mountaineer. The pass was in use before any other was known across the main chain of Mont Blanc, and down to the present time it remains the easiest and quickest route from Chamonix to Courmayeur, with the single exception of the pass that we crossed upon the 3rd of July for the first time, which lies about midway between the Aiguille de Triolet and the Aiguille de Talèfre, and which, for want of a better name, I have called the Col de Talèfre. When one looks down toward the upper end of the Glacier de Talèfre from the direction of the Jardin or of the Couvercle, the ridge that bounds the view seems to be of little elevation. It is overpowered by the colossal Grand Jorasses and by the almost equally magnificent Aiguille Verte. The ridge, notwithstanding, is by no means despicable. At no point is its elevation less than 11,600 feet. It does not look anything like this height. The Glacier de Talèfre mounts with a steady incline, and the eye is completely deceived. In 1864, when prowling about with Mr. Riley, I instinctively fixed upon a bent couloir which led up from the glacier to the lowest part of the ridge, and when after crossing the Col de Triolet I saw that the other side presented no particular difficulty, it seemed to me that this was the one point in the whole of the range which would afford an easier passage than the Col du Géant. We set out from the Montanvert at 4 a.m. upon July 3rd to see whether this opinion was correct, and it fortunately happened that the Reverend A. G. Girdleston and a friend, with 2 Chamonix guides, left the inn at the same hour as ourselves to cross the Col du Géant. We kept in company as far as our routes lay together, and at 9:35 we arrived at the top of our pass, having taken the route to the south of the Jardin. Description is unnecessary, as our track is laid down very clearly on the engraving at the head of this chapter. Much snow had fallen during the late bad weather, and as we reposed upon the top of our pass, which was about 11,650 feet above the level of the sea and 600 feet above the Col du Géant, We saw that the descent of the rocks which intervened between us and the Glacier de Triolet would require some caution, for the sun's rays poured down directly upon them, and the snow slipped away every now and then from ledge to ledge, just as if it had been water, in cascades not large enough to be imposing, but sufficient to knock us over if we got in their way. This little bit of cliff consequently took a longer time than it should have done, for when we heard the indescribable swishing, hissing sound which announced a coming fall, we of necessity huddled under the lee of the rocks until the snow ceased to shoot over us. We got to the level of the Glacier de Triolet without misadventure, then steered for its left bank to avoid the upper of its two formidable ice falls, and after descending the requisite distance by some old snow lying between the glacier and the cliffs which border it, crossed directly to the right bank over the level ice between the two ice falls. The right bank was gained without any trouble, and we found there numerous beds of hard snow (avalanche debris) down which we could run or glissade as fast as we liked. Glissading is a very pleasant employment when it is accomplished successfully, and I have never seen a place where it could be more safely indulged in than the snowy valley on the right bank of the Glacier de Triolet. In my dreams I glissade delightfully, but in practice I find that somehow the snow will not behave properly, and that my alpenstock will get between my legs. Then my legs go where my head should be, and I see the sky revolving at a rapid pace, the snow rises up and smites me and runs away, and when it is at last overtaken it suddenly stops, and we come into violent collision. Those who are with me say that I tumble head over heels, and there may be some truth in what they say. Streaks of ice are apt to make the heels shoot away, and stray stones cause one to pitch headlong down. Somehow these things always seem to come in the way, so it is as well to glissade only when there is something soft to tumble into. Footnote: in glissading, an erect position should be maintained, and the point of the alpenstock allowed to trail over the snow. If it is necessary to stop or to slacken speed, the point is pressed against the slope, as shown in the illustration. End footnote. Near the termination of the glacier we could not avoid traversing a portion of its abominable moraine, but at 1:30 p.m. we were clear of it and threw ourselves upon some springy turf, conscious that our day's work was over. An hour afterward we resumed the march, crossed the Doire torrent by a bridge a little below Gruetta, and at 5 o'clock entered Courmayeur, having occupied somewhat less than 10 hours on the way. Mr. Girdleston's party came in, I believe, about 4 hours afterward, so there was no doubt that we made a shorter pass than the Col du Géant, and I believe we discovered a quicker way of getting from Chamonix to Courmayeur, or vice versa, than will be found elsewhere, so long as the chain of Mont Blanc remains in its present condition. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Ascent of the Runette, the Matterhorn. All of the excursions that were set down in my program had been carried out with the exception of the ascent of the Matterhorn, and we now turned our faces in its direction. But instead of returning via the Val Tournanche, we took a route across country and bagged upon our way the summit of the Runette. We passed the night of July 4th at Aosta, under the roof of the genial Terra, and on the 5th went by the Val d'Ollemont and the Col de la Fenêtre, 9,140 feet, to Chermontagne. We slept that night at the chalets of Chanrion, a foul spot which should be avoided, left them at 3:50 the next morning, and after a short scramble over the slope above and a half-mile tramp on the Glacier de Brenay, we crossed directly to the Runette and went almost straight up it. There is not, I suppose, another mountain in the Alps of the same height that can be ascended so easily. You have only to go ahead. Upon its southern side one can walk about almost anywhere. Though I speak thus slightingly of a very respectable peak, I will not do anything of the kind in regard to the view which it gives. It is happily placed in respect to the rest of the Pennine Alps, and as a standpoint it has not many superiors. You see mountains and nothing but mountains. It is a solemn, some would say a dreary view, but it is very grand. The great Combin, 14,164 feet, with its noble background of the whole range of Mont Blanc, never looks so big as it does from here. In the contrary direction, the Matterhorn overpowers all besides. The Dent d'Héron, although closer, looks a mere outlier of its great neighbor, and the snows of Monte Rosa behind seem intended for no purpose than to give relief to the crags in front. To the south there is an endless array of becs and beccas backed by the great Italian peaks, while to the north Mont Pleureur, 12,159 feet, holds its own against the more distant Wildstrubel. We gained the summit at 9:15 and stayed there an hour and a half. My faithful guides then admonished me that Prerayen, whither we were bound, was still far away, and that we had yet to cross 2 lofty ridges. So we resumed our harness and departed, not, however, before a huge cairn had been built out of the blocks of gneiss with which the summit is bestrewn. Then we trotted down the slopes of the Runette, over the Glacier de Runette, and across a pass which, if it deserves a name, may be called the Col des Portants, after the neighboring peaks. From thence we proceeded across the great Otema glacier toward the Col Dolent. The part of the glacier that we traversed was overspread with snow, which completely concealed its numerous pitfalls. We marched across it in single file, and of course roped together. All at once Alma dropped into a crevasse up to his shoulders. I pulled in the rope immediately, but the snow gave way as it was being done, and I had to spread out my arms to stop my descent. Biener held fast, but said afterward that his feet went through as well, so for a moment all three were in the jaws of the crevasse. We now altered our course so as to take the fissures transversely, and after the center of the glacier was passed, changed it again and made directly for the summit of the Col Dolent. It is scarcely necessary to observe, after what has been before said, that it is my invariable practice to employ a rope when traversing a snow-covered glacier. Many guides, even the best ones, object to be roped, more especially early in the morning when the snow is hard. They object sometimes because they think it unnecessary. Crevasses that are bridged by snow are almost always more or less perceptible by undulations on the surface. The snow droops down and hollows mark the course of the chasms beneath. An experienced guide usually notices these almost imperceptible wrinkles, steps one side or the other as the case may require, and rarely breaks through unawares. Guides think there is no occasion to employ a rope, because they think they will not be taken by surprise. Michel Croz used to be of this opinion. He used to say that only imbeciles and children required to be tied up in the morning. I told him that in this particular matter I was a child to him. You see these things, my good Croz, and avoid them. I do not, except you point them out to me, and so that which is not a danger to you is a danger to me. The sharper one's eyes get by use, the less a rope is required as a protective against these hidden pitfalls, but according to my experience, the sight never becomes so keen that they can be avoided with unvarying certainty, and I mentioned what occurred upon the Otema glacier to show that this is so. I well remember my first passage of the Col Théodule, the easiest of the higher Alpine glacier passes. We had a rope, but my guide said it was not necessary. He knew all the crevasses. However, we did not go a quarter of a mile before he dropped through the snow into a crevasse up to his neck. He was a heavy man and would scarcely have extricated himself alone. Anyhow, he was very glad of my assistance. When he got onto his legs again, he said, "Well, I had no idea there was a crevasse there." He no longer objected to use the rope, and we proceeded, upon my part with greater peace of mind than before. I have crossed the pass 13 times since then, and have invariably insisted upon being tied. Guides object to the use of the rope upon snow-covered glacier because they are afraid of being laughed at by their comrades, and this perhaps is the more common reason. To illustrate this, here is another Théodule experience. We arrived at the edge of the ice, and I required to be tied. My guide, a Zermatt man of repute, said that no one used a rope going across that pass. I declined to argue the matter, and we put on the rope, though very much against the wish of my man, who protested that he should have to submit to perpetual ridicule if we met any of his acquaintances. We had not gone very far before we saw a train coming in the contrary direction. "Ah!" cried my man, "there is R," mentioning a guide who used to be kept at the Riffel Hotel for the ascent of Monte Rosa. "It will be as I said. I shall never hear the end of this." The guide we met was followed by a string of tomfools, none of whom were tied together, and had his face covered by a mask to prevent it becoming blistered. After we had passed, I said, "Now, should R make any observations to you, ask him why he takes such extraordinary care to preserve the skin of his face, which will grow again in a week, when he neglects such an obvious precaution in regard to his life, which he can only lose once." This was quite a new idea to my guide, and he said nothing more against the use of the rope, so long as we were together. I believe that the unwillingness to use a rope upon snow-covered glacier, which born mountaineers not unfrequently exhibit, arises, first on the part of expert men from the consciousness that they themselves incur little risk; secondly, on the part of inferior men from fear of ridicule and from aping the ways of their superiors; and thirdly, from pure ignorance or laziness. Whatever may be the reason, I raise my voice against the neglect of a precaution so simple and so effectual. In my opinion, the very first thing a glacier traveler requires is plenty of good rope. A committee of the English Alpine Club was appointed in 1864 to test and to report upon the most suitable ropes for mountaineering purposes, and those which were approved are probably as good as can be found. One is made of Manila and another of Italian hemp. The former is the heavier, and weighs a little more than an ounce per foot, 103 ounces to 100 feet. The latter weighs 79 ounces per 100 feet, but I prefer the Manila rope because it is more easy to handle. Both of these ropes will sustain 168 pounds falling 10 feet, or 196 pounds falling 8 feet, and they break with a dead weight of 2 tons. In 1865 we carried 200 feet lengths of the Manila rope, and the inconvenience arising from its weight was more than made up for by the security which it afforded. Upon several occasions it was worth more than an extra guide. Now, touching the use of the rope, there is a right way and there are wrong ways of using it. I often meet, upon glacier passes, elegantly got-up persons who are clearly out of their element, with a guide stalking along in front, who pays no attention to the innocents in his charge. They are tied together as a matter of form, but they evidently have no idea why they are tied up, for they walk side by side or close together, with the rope trailing in the snow. If one tumbles into a crevasse, the rest stare and say, "La! What is the matter with Smith?" Unless, as is more likely, they all tumble in together. This is the wrong way to use a rope. It is abuse of the rope. It is of the first importance to keep the rope taut from man to man. There is no real security if this is not done, and your risks may be considerably magnified. There is little or no difficulty in extricating one man who breaks through a bridged crevasse if the rope is taut, but the case may be very awkward if two break through at the same moment, close together, and there are only 2 others to aid, or perhaps only 1 other. Furthermore, the rope ought not upon any account to graze over snow, ice, or rocks, otherwise the strands suffer and the lives of the whole party may be endangered. Apart from this, it is extremely annoying to have a rope knocking about one's heels. If circumstances render it impossible for the rope to be kept taut by itself, the men behind should gather it up round their hands and not allow it to incommode those in advance. Footnote: For example, when the leader suspects crevasses and sounds for them in the manner shown in the engraving, he usually loses half a step or more. The second man should take a turn of the rope round his hand to draw it back in case the leader goes through. End of footnote. A man must either be incompetent, careless, or selfish if he permits the rope to dangle about the heels of the person in front of him. The distance from man to man must be neither too great nor too small. About 12 feet is sufficient. If there are only 2 or 3 persons, it is prudent to allow a little more, say 15 feet. More than this is unnecessary, and less than 9 or 10 feet is not much good. It is essential to examine your rope from time to time to see that it is in good condition. If you are wise, you will do this yourself every day. Latterly, I have examined every inch of my rope overnight, and upon more than one occasion have found the strands of the manila rope nearly half severed through accidental grazes. Thus far, the rope has been supposed to be employed upon level, snow-covered glacier, to prevent any risk from concealed crevasses. On rocks and on slopes it is used for a different purpose, namely to guard against slips, and in these cases it is equally important to keep it taut and to preserve a reasonable distance one from the other. It is much more troublesome to keep the rope taut upon slopes than upon the level, and upon difficult rocks it is all but impossible, except by adopting the plan of moving only one at a time. From the Col Dolent we proceeded down the combe of the same name to the chalet of Prerayen, and passed the night of the 6th under the roof of our old acquaintance, the wealthy herdsman. On the 7th we crossed the Vacroner Pass en route for Breuil. My thoughts were fixed on the Matterhorn, and my guides knew that I wished them to accompany me. They had an aversion to the mountain, and repeatedly expressed their belief that it was useless to try to ascend it. "Anything but Matterhorn, dear sir," said Alma, "anything but Matterhorn." He did not speak of difficulty or of danger, nor was he shirking work. He offered to go anywhere, but he entreated that the Matterhorn should be abandoned. Both men spoke fairly enough. They did not think that an ascent could be made, and for their own credit, as well as for my sake, they did not wish to undertake a business which in their opinion would only lead to loss of time and money. I sent them by the short cut to Breuil, and walked down to Val Tournanche to look for Jean-Antoine Carrel. He was not there. The villagers said that he and 3 others had started on the 6th to try the Matterhorn by the old way, on their own account. They will have no luck, I thought, for the clouds were low down on the mountain, and I walked up to Breuil fully expecting to meet them. Nor was I disappointed. About halfway up I saw a group of men clustered around a chalet upon the other side of the torrent, and crossing over found that the party had returned. Jean-Antoine and César were there, C.E. Gorret and J.J. Maquinaz. They had had no success. The weather, they said, had been horrible, and they had scarcely reached the Glacier du Lion. I explained the situation to Carrel, and proposed that we, with César and another man, should cross the Théodule by moonlight on the 9th, and that upon the 10th we should pitch the tent as high as possible upon the east face. He was unwilling to abandon the old route, and urged me to try it again. I promised to do so provided the new route failed. This satisfied him, and he agreed to my proposal. I then went up to Breuil, and discharged Alma and Bina, with much regret, for no 2 men ever served me more faithfully or more willingly. Footnote: during the preceding 18 days, I exclude Sundays and other non-working days, we ascended more than 100,000 feet and descended 98,000 feet. End footnote. On the next day they crossed to Zermatt. The 8th was occupied with preparations. The weather was stormy, and black, rainy vapors obscured the mountains. Toward evening a young man came from Val Tournanche and reported that an Englishman was lying there extremely ill. Now was the time for the performance of my vow, and on the morning of Sunday the 9th I went down the valley to look after the sick man. On my way I passed a foreign gentleman with a mule and several porters laden with baggage. Amongst these men were Jean-Antoine and César, carrying some barometers. "Hullo," I said, "what are you doing?" They explained that the foreigner had arrived just as they were setting out, and they were assisting his porters. "Very well, go on to Breuil and await me there. We start at midnight as agreed." Jean-Antoine then said that he should not be able to serve me after Tuesday the 11th, as he was engaged to travel with a family of distinction in the valley of Aosta. "And César?" "And César also." "Why did you not say this before?" "Because," said he, "it was not settled. The engagement is of long standing, but the day was not fixed. When I got back to Val Tournanche on Friday night after leaving you, I found a letter naming the day. I could not object to the answer, but the prospect of being left guideless was provoking. They went up, and I down the valley." The sick man declared that he was better, though the exertion of saying as much tumbled him over onto the floor in a fainting fit. He was badly in want of medicine, and I tramped down to Châtillon to get it. It was late before I returned to Val Tournanche, for the weather was tempestuous and the rain fell in torrents. A figure passed me under the church porch. "Qui vive?" "Jean-Antoine." "I thought you were at Breuil." "No, sir. When the storm came on, I knew we should not start tonight, and so came down to sleep here." "Ha, Carrel," I said, "this is a great bore. If tomorrow is not fine, we shall not be able to do anything together. I have sent away my guides, relying on you, and now you are going to leave me to travel with a party of ladies. That work is not fit for you." He smiled, I suppose, at the implied compliment. "Can't you send someone else instead?" "No, monsieur. I am sorry, but my word is pledged. I should like to accompany you, but I can't break my engagement." By this time we had arrived at the inn door. "Well, it is no fault of yours. Come presently with César and have some wine." They came, and we sat up till midnight, recounting our old adventures in the inn of Val Tournanche. The weather continued bad upon the 10th, and I returned to Breuil. The two Carrels were again hovering about the above-mentioned chalet, and I bade them adieu. In the evening the sick man crawled up, a good deal better, but his was the only arrival. The Monday crowd did not cross the Théodule on account of the continued storms. Footnote: Tourists usually congregate at Zermatt upon Sundays, and large gangs and droves cross the Théodule Pass on Mondays. End footnote. The inn was lonely. I went to bed early, and was awoke the next morning by the invalid inquiring if I had heard the news. "No, what news?" "Why," said he, "a large party of guides went off this morning to try the Matterhorn, taking with them a mule laden with provisions." I went to the door, and with a telescope saw the party upon the lower slope of the mountain. Favre, the landlord, stood by. "What is all this about?" I inquired. "Who is the leader of this party?" "Carrel." "What, Jean-Antoine?" "Yes, Jean-Antoine." "Is César there too?" "Yes, he is there." Then I saw in a moment that I had been bamboozled and humbugged, and learned bit by bit that the affair had been arranged long beforehand. The start on the 6th had been for a preliminary reconnaissance. The mule that I passed was conveying stores for the attack. The family of distinction was Signor F. Giordano, who had just dispatched the party to facilitate the way to the summit, and who, when the facilitation was completed, was to be taken to the top along with Signor Sella. Footnote: the Italian minister. Signor Giordano had undertaken the business arrangements for Signor Sella. End footnote. I was greatly mortified. My plans were upset. The Italians had clearly stolen a march upon me, and I saw that the astute Favre chuckled over my discomfiture, because the route by the eastern face, if successful, would not benefit his inn. What was to be done? I retired to my room, and, soothed by tobacco, re-studied my plans to see if it was not possible to outmaneuver the Italians. They have taken a mule load of provisions. That is one point in my favor, for they will take 2 or 3 days to get through the food, and until that is done no work will be accomplished. How is the weather? I went to the window. The mountain was smothered up in mist, another point in my favor. They are to facilitate the way. Well, if they do that to any purpose, it will be a long job. Altogether I reckoned that they could not possibly ascend the mountain and come back to Breuil in less than 7 days. I got cooler, for it was evident that the wily ones might be outwitted after all. There was time enough to go to Zermatt to try the eastern face, and should it prove impracticable, to come back to Breuil before the men returned. And then it seemed to me, as the mountain was not yet padlocked, one might start at the same time as the messieurs, and yet get to the top before them. The first thing to do was to go to Zermatt. Easier said than done. The 7 guides upon the mountain included the ablest men in the valley, and none of the ordinary muleteer guides were at Breuil. 2 men at least were wanted for my baggage, but not a soul could be found. I ran about and sent about in all directions, but not a single porter could be obtained. One was with Carrel, another was ill, another was at Châtillon, and so forth. Even Meynet the hunchback could not be induced to come. He was in the thick of some important cheese-making operations. I was in the position of a general without an army. It was all very well to make plans, but there was no one to execute them. This did not much trouble me, for it was evident that so long as the weather stopped traffic over the Théodule, it would hinder the men equally upon the Matterhorn, and I knew that directly it improved, company would certainly arrive. About midday on Tuesday the 11th, a large party hove in sight from Zermatt, preceded by a nimble young Englishman and one of old Peter Taugwalder's sons. Footnote: Peter Taugwalder, the father, is called Old Peter, to distinguish him from his eldest son, Young Peter. In 1865, the father's age was about 45. End of footnote. I went at once to this gentleman to learn if he could dispense with Taugwalder. He said that he could not, as they were going to recross to Zermatt on the morrow, but that the young man should assist in transporting my baggage, as he had nothing to carry. We naturally got into conversation. I told my story, and learned that the young Englishman was Lord Francis Douglas, whose recent exploit, the ascent of the Gabelhorn, had excited my wonder and admiration. Footnote: brother of the present Marquis of Queensberry. End footnote. He brought good news. Old Peter had lately been beyond the Hörnli, and had reported that he thought that an ascent of the Matterhorn was possible upon that side. Alma had left Zermatt and could not be recovered, so I determined to seek for old Peter. Lord Francis Douglas expressed a warm desire to ascend the mountain, and before long it was determined that he should take part in the expedition. Favre could no longer hinder our departure, and lent us one of his men. We crossed the Col Théodule on Wednesday morning, the 12th of July, rounded the foot of the Ober Théodule Gletscher, crossed the Furgen Gletscher, and deposited tent, blankets, ropes, and other things in the little chapel at the Schwarzsee. All 4 were heavily laden, for we brought across the whole of my stores from Breuil. Of rope there were about 600 feet. There were 3 kinds. First, 200 feet of Manila rope. Second, 150 feet of a stouter and probably stronger rope than the first. And third, more than 200 feet of a lighter and weaker rope than the first, of a kind that I used formerly, stout sash line. We descended at Zermatt, sought and engaged old Peter, and gave him permission to choose another guide. When we returned to the Monte Rosa Hotel, whom should we see sitting upon the wall in front but my old guide-chef, Michel Croz. I supposed that he had come with Mr. B., but I learned that that gentleman had arrived in ill health at Chamonix and had returned to England. Croz, thus left free, had been immediately engaged by the Reverend Charles Hudson, and they had come to Zermatt with the same object as ourselves, namely to attempt the ascent of the Matterhorn. Lord Francis Douglas and I dined at the Monte Rosa, and had just finished when Mr. Hudson and a friend entered the salle à manger. They had returned from inspecting the mountain, and some idlers in the room demanded their intentions. We heard a confirmation of Croz's statement, and learned that Mr. Hudson intended to set out on the morrow at the same hour as ourselves. We left the room to consult, and agreed it was undesirable that 2 independent parties should be on the mountain at the same time with the same object. Mr. Hudson was therefore invited to join us, and he accepted our proposal. Before admitting his friend Mr. Hadow, I took the precaution to inquire what he had done in the Alps, and, as well as I remember, Mr. Hudson's reply was, "Mr. Hadow has done Mont Blanc in less time than most men." He then mentioned several other excursions that were unknown to me, and added, in answer to a further question, "I consider he is a sufficiently good man to go with us." Mr. Hadow was admitted without any further question, and we then went into the matter of guides. Hudson thought that Croz and old Peter would be sufficient. The question was referred to the men themselves, and they made no objection. So Croz and I became comrades once more, and as I threw myself on my bed and tried to go to sleep, I wondered at the strange series of chances which had first separated us and then brought us together again. I thought of the mistake through which he had accepted the engagement to Mr. B., of his unwillingness to adopt my route, of his recommendation to transfer our energies to the chain of Mont Blanc, of the retirement of Aimer and Biener, of the desertion of Carrel, of the arrival of Lord Francis Douglas, and lastly of our accidental meeting at Zermatt. And as I pondered over these things, I could not help asking, what next? If any one of the links of this fatal chain of circumstances had been omitted, what a different story I should have to tell. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, The Ascent of the Matterhorn. We started from Zermatt on the 13th of July at 5:30 on a brilliant and perfectly cloudless morning. We were 8 in number, Croz, old Peter and his 2 sons, Lord Francis Douglas, Hadow, Hudson, and I. 2 footnotes. First footnote. The 2 young Taugwalders were taken as porters by desire of their father, and carried provisions amply sufficient for 3 days, in case the ascent should prove more troublesome than we anticipated. End of first footnote. Second footnote. I remember speaking about pedestrianism to a well-known mountaineer some years ago, and ventured to remark that a man who has averaged 30 miles a day might be considered a good walker. A fair walker, he said, a fair walker. What then would you consider good walking? Well, he replied, I will tell you. Some time back a friend and I agreed to go to Switzerland, but a short time afterward he wrote me to say he ought to let me know that a young and delicate lad was going with him who would not be equal to great things. In fact, he would not be able to do more than 50 miles a day. What became of the young and delicate lad? He lives. And who was your extraordinary friend? Charles Hudson. I have every reason to believe that the gentlemen referred to were equal to walking more than 50 miles a day, but they were exceptional, not good pedestrians. Charles Hudson, vicar of Skillington in Lincolnshire, was considered by the mountaineering fraternity to be the best amateur of his time. He was the organizer and leader of the party of Englishmen who ascended Mont Blanc by the Aiguille du Goutet, and who descended by the Grand Mulets route without guides in 1855. His long practice made him sure-footed, and in that respect he was not greatly inferior to a born mountaineer. I remember him as a well-made man of middle height and age, neither stout nor thin, with face pleasant though grave, and with quiet, unassuming manners. Although an athletic man, he would have been overlooked in a crowd, and although he had done the greatest mountaineering feats which have been done, he was the last man to speak of his own doings. His friend, Mr. Hadow, was a young man of 19, who had the looks and manners of a greater age. He was a rapid walker, but 1865 was his first season in the Alps. Lord Francis Douglas was about the same age as Mr. Hadow. He had the advantage of several seasons in the Alps. He was nimble as a deer, and was becoming an expert mountaineer. Just before our meeting he had ascended the Obergabelhorn with old Peter and Joseph Jenin, and this gave me a high opinion of his powers, for I had examined that mountain all round a few weeks before, and had declined its ascent on account of its apparent difficulty. My personal acquaintance with Mr. Hudson was very slight. Still, I should have been content to have placed myself under his orders if he had chosen to claim the position to which he was entitled. Those who knew him will not be surprised to learn that, so far from doing this, he lost no opportunity in consulting the wishes and opinions of those around him. We deliberated together whenever there was occasion, and our authority was recognized by the others. Whatever responsibility there was devolved upon us. I recollect with satisfaction that there was no difference of opinion between us as to what should be done, and that the most perfect harmony existed between all of us so long as we were together. End of second footnote. To ensure steady motion, one tourist and one native walked together. The youngest Taugwalder fell to my share, and the lad marched well, proud to be on the expedition and happy to show his powers. The wine bags also fell to my lot to carry, and throughout the day, after each drink, I replenished them secretly with water, so that at the next halt they were found fuller than before. This was considered a good omen, and little short of miraculous. On the first day we did not intend to ascend to any great height, and we mounted accordingly very leisurely, picked up the things which were left in the chapel at the Schwarzsee at 8:20, and proceeded thence along the ridge connecting the Hörnli with the Matterhorn. At 11:30 we arrived at the base of the actual peak, then quitted the ridge and clambered round some ledges onto the eastern face. We were now fairly upon the mountain, and were astonished to find that places which from the Riffel or even from the Furggengletscher looked entirely impracticable were so easy that we could run about. Before 12 o'clock we had found a good position for the tent at a height of 11,000 feet. Footnote. Thus far the guides did not once go to the front. Hudson or I led, and when any cutting was required we did it ourselves. This was done to spare the guides, and to show them that we were thoroughly in earnest. The spot at which we camped was just 4 hours' walking from Zermatt. End footnote. Croz and young Peter went on to see what was above, in order to save time on the following morning. They cut across the heads of the snow slopes which descended towards the Furggengletscher, and disappeared round a corner, but shortly afterward we saw them high up on the face, moving quickly. We others made a solid platform for the tent in a well-protected spot, and then watched eagerly for the return of the men. The stones which they upset told us that they were very high, and we supposed that the way must be easy. At length, just before 3 p.m., we saw them coming down, evidently much excited. "What are they saying, Peter?" "Gentlemen, they say it is no good." But when they came near we heard a different story. Nothing but what was good, not a difficulty, not a single difficulty. We could have gone to the summit and returned today easily. We passed the remaining hours of daylight, some basking in the sunshine, some sketching or collecting, and when the sun went down, giving as it departed a glorious promise for the morrow, we returned to the tent to arrange for the night. Hudson made tea, I coffee, and we then retired each one to his blanket bag, the Taugwalders, Lord Francis Douglas and myself occupying the tent, the others remaining by preference outside. Long after dusk the cliffs above echoed with our laughter and with the songs of the guides, for we were happy that night in camp and feared no evil. We assembled together outside the tent before dawn on the morning of the 14th, and started directly it was light enough to move. Young Peter came on with us as a guide, and his brother returned to Zermatt. We followed the route which had been taken on the previous day, and in a few minutes turned the rib which had intercepted the view of the eastern face from our tent platform. The whole of this great slope was now revealed, rising for 3,000 feet like a huge natural staircase. Some parts were more and others were less easy, but we were not once brought to a halt by any serious impediment, for when an obstruction was met in front it could always be turned to the right or to the left. For the greater part of the way there was indeed no occasion for the rope, and sometimes Hudson led, sometimes myself. At 6:20 we had attained a height of 12,800 feet and halted for half an hour. We then continued the ascent without a break until 9:55, when we stopped for 50 minutes at a height of 14,000 feet. Twice we struck the northeastern ridge and followed it for some little distance, to no advantage, for it was usually more rotten and steep, and always more difficult than the face. Still we kept near to it, lest stones perchance should fall. We had now arrived at the foot of that part which from the Riffelberg or from Zermatt seems perpendicular or overhanging, and could no longer continue upon the eastern side. For a little distance we ascended by snow upon the arête, that is, the ridge, descending toward Zermatt, and then by common consent turned over to the right, or to the northern side. Before doing so, we made a change in the order of ascent. Croz went first, I followed, Hudson came third, Hadow and old Peter were last. "Now," said Croz as he led off, "now for something altogether different." The work became difficult and required caution. In some places there was little to hold, and it was desirable that those should be in front who were the least likely to slip. The general slope of the mountain at this part was less than 40 degrees, and snow had accumulated in and had filled up the interstices of the rock face, leaving only occasional fragments projecting here and there. These were at times covered with a thin film of ice produced from the melting and refreezing of the snow. It was the counterpart, on a small scale, of the upper 700 feet of the Pointe des Écrins, only there was this material difference. The face of the Écrins was about or exceeded an angle of 50 degrees, and the Matterhorn face was less than 40 degrees. It was a place over which any fair mountaineer might pass in safety, and Mr. Hudson ascended this part, and as far as I know the entire mountain, without having the slightest assistance rendered to him on any occasion. Sometimes after I had taken a hand from Croz or received a pull, I turned to offer the same to Hudson, but he invariably declined, saying it was not necessary. Mr. Hadow, however, was not accustomed to this kind of work, and required continual assistance. It is only fair to say that the difficulty which he found at this part arose simply and entirely from want of experience. This solitary difficult part was of no great extent. We bore away over it at first nearly horizontally, for a distance of about 400 feet, and then ascended directly toward the summit for about 60 feet, and then doubled back to the ridge which descends toward Zermatt. A long stride round a rather awkward corner brought us to snow once more. The last doubt vanished, the Matterhorn was ours. Nothing but 200 feet of easy snow remained to be surmounted. You must now carry your thoughts back to the 7 Italians who started from Breuil on the 11th of July. 4 days had passed since their departure, and we were tormented with anxiety lest they should arrive on the top before us. All the way up we had talked of them, and many false alarms of "men on the summit" had been raised. The higher we rose, the more intense became the excitement. What if we should be beaten at the last moment? The slope eased off. At length we could be detached, and Croz and I, dashing away, ran a neck-and-neck race which ended in a dead heat. At 1:40 p.m. the world was at our feet, and the Matterhorn was conquered. Hurrah! Not a footstep could be seen. It was not yet certain that we had not been beaten. The summit of the Matterhorn was formed of a rudely level ridge about 350 feet long, and the Italians might have been at its farther extremity. Footnote: the highest points are toward the two ends. In 1865 the northern end was slightly higher than the southern one. In bygone years Carrel and I often suggested to each other that we might one day arrive upon the top, and find ourselves cut off from the very highest point by a notch in the summit ridge which is seen from the Théodule and from Breuil. This notch is very conspicuous from below, but when one is actually upon the summit it is hardly noticed, and it can be passed without the least difficulty. End of footnote. I hastened to the southern end, scanning the snow right and left eagerly. Hurrah again! It was untrodden. Where were the men? I peered over the cliff, half doubting, half expectant. I saw them immediately, mere dots on the ridge, at an immense distance below. Up went my arms and my hat. Croz, Croz, come here. Where are they, monsieur? There, don't you see them down there? Ah, the coquins, they are low down. Croz, we must make those fellows hear us. We yelled until we were hoarse. The Italians seemed to regard us. We could not be certain. Croz, we must make them hear us. They shall hear us. I seized a block of rock and hurled it down and called upon my companion in the name of friendship to do the same. We drove our sticks in and prized away the crags, and soon a torrent of stones poured down the cliffs. There was no mistake about it this time. The Italians turned and fled. Footnote. I have learned since from J. A. Carrel that they heard our first cries. They were then upon the southwest ridge, close to the Cravate, and 1,250 feet below us, as the crow flies, at a distance of about 1/3 of a mile. End footnote. Still, I would that the leader of that party could have stood with us at that moment, for our victorious shouts conveyed to him the disappointment of the ambition of a lifetime. He was the man, of all those who attempted the ascent of the Matterhorn, who most deserved to be the first upon its summit. He was the first to doubt its inaccessibility, and he was the only man who persisted in believing that its ascent could be accomplished. It was the aim of his life to make the ascent from the side of Italy for the honor of his native valley. For a time he had the game in his hands. He played it as he thought best, but he made a false move and lost it. Times have changed with Carrel. His supremacy is questioned in the Val Tournanche. New men have arisen, and he is no longer recognized as the chasseur above all others. But so long as he remains the man that he is today, it will not be easy to find his superior. The others had arrived, so we went back to the northern end of the ridge. Croz now took the tent pole and planted it in the highest snow. Footnote. At our departure the men were confident that the ascent would be made, and took one of the poles out of the tent. I protested that it was tempting Providence. They took the pole nevertheless. End of footnote. Yes, we said, there is the flagstaff, but where is the flag? Here it is, he answered, pulling off his blouse and fixing it to the stick. It made a poor flag, and there was no wind to float it out, yet it was seen all around. They saw it at Zermatt, at the Riffel, in the Val Tournanche. At Breuil the watchers cried, "Victory is ours!" They raised bravos for Carrel and vivas for Italy, and hastened to put themselves en fête. On the morrow they were undeceived. All was changed. The explorers returned sad, cast down, disheartened, confounded, gloomy. "It is true," said the men. "We saw them ourselves. They hurled stones at us. The old traditions are true. There are spirits on the top of the Matterhorn." Footnote. Signor Giordano was naturally disappointed at the result, and wished the men to start again. They all refused to do so, with the exception of Jean Antoine. Upon the 16th of July he set out again with 3 others, and upon the 17th gained the summit by passing at first up the southwest ridge, and afterward by turning over to the Z'Mutt or northwestern side. On the 18th he returned to Breuil. Whilst we were on the southern end of the summit ridge, we paid some attention to the portion of the mountain which intervened between ourselves and the Italian guides. It seemed as if there would not be the least chance for them if they should attempt to storm the final peak directly from the end of the shoulder. In that direction cliffs fell sheer down from the summit, and we were unable to see beyond a certain distance. There remained the route about which Carrel and I had often talked, namely, to ascend directly at first from the end of the shoulder, and afterward to swerve to the left, that is, to the Z'Mutt side, and to complete the ascent from the northwest. When we were upon the summit we laughed at this idea. The part of the mountain that I have described upon page 619 was not easy, although its inclination was moderate. If that slope were made only 10 degrees steeper, its difficulty would be enormously increased. To double its inclination would be to make it impracticable. The slope at the southern end of the summit ridge, falling toward the northwest, was much steeper than that over which we had passed, and we ridiculed the idea that any person should attempt to ascend it in that direction when the northern route was so easy. Nevertheless, the summit was reached by that route by the undaunted Carrel. From knowing the final slope over which he passed, and from the account of Mr. F. C. Grove, who is the only traveler by whom it has been traversed, I do not hesitate to term the ascent of Carrel and Biche in 1865 the most desperate piece of mountain scrambling upon record. In 1869 I asked Carrel if he had ever done anything more difficult. His reply was, "Man cannot do anything much more difficult than that." End of footnote. We returned to the southern end of the ridge to build a cairn, and then paid homage to the view. Footnote. The summit ridge was much shattered, although not so extensively as the southwest and northeast ridges. The highest rock in 1865 was a block of mica schist, and the fragment I broke off it not only possesses in a remarkable degree the character of the peak, but mimics in an astonishing manner the details of its form. See illustration on page 622. End of footnote. The day was one of those superlatively calm and clear ones which usually precede bad weather. The atmosphere was perfectly still and free from all clouds or vapors. Mountains 50, nay 100 miles off looked sharp and near. All their details, ridge and crag, snow and glacier, stood out with faultless definition. Pleasant thoughts of happy days and bygone years came up unbidden as we recognized the old familiar forms. All were revealed. Not one of the principal peaks of the Alps was hidden. Footnote. It is most unusual to see the southern half of the panorama unclouded. 100 ascents may be made before this will be the case again. End of footnote. I see them clearly now, the great inner circle of giants, backed by the ranges, chains and massifs. First came the Dent Blanche, hoary and grand, the Gabelhorn and pointed Rothhorn, and then the peerless Weisshorn, the towering Mischabelhörner, flanked by the Allerleinhorn, Strahlhorn and Rimpfischhorn, then Monte Rosa with its many Spitzes, the Lyskam and the Breithorn. Behind were the Bernese Oberland, governed by the Finsteraarhorn, the Simplon and the Saint Gothard groups, the Disgrazia and the Ortela. Toward the south we looked down to Chivasso on the plain of Piedmont, and far beyond. The Viso, 100 miles away, seemed close upon us. The Maritime Alps, 130 miles distant, were free from haze. Then came my first love, the Pelvoux, the Écrins and the Meije, the clusters of the Graians, and lastly, in the west, gorgeous in the full sunlight, rose the monarch of all, Mont Blanc. 10,000 feet beneath us were the green fields of Zermatt, dotted with chalets, from which blue smoke rose lazily. 8,000 feet below, on the other side, were the pastures of Breuil. There were forests black and gloomy, and meadows bright and lively, bounding waterfalls and tranquil lakes, fertile lands and savage wastes, sunny plains and frigid plateaus. There were the most rugged forms and the most graceful outlines, bold, perpendicular cliffs and gentle, undulating slopes, rocky mountains and snowy mountains, somber and solemn or glittering and white, with walls, turrets, pinnacles, pyramids, domes, cones and spires. There was every combination that the world can give, and every contrast that the heart could desire. We remained on the summit for 1 hour, one crowded hour of glorious life. It passed away too quickly, and we began to prepare for the descent. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, Descent of the Matterhorn. Hudson and I again consulted as to the best and safest arrangement of the party. We agreed that it would be best for Croz to go first and Hadow second. Hudson, who was almost equal to a guide in sureness of foot, wished to be third. Lord F. Douglas was placed next, and old Peter the strongest of the remainder after him. Footnote: if the members of the party had been more equally efficient, Croz would have been placed last. End footnote. I suggested to Hudson that we should attach a rope to the rocks on our arrival at the difficult bit, and hold it as we descended as an additional protection. He approved the idea, but it was not definitely settled that it should be done. A few minutes afterward I tied myself to young Peter, ran down after the others, and caught them just as they were commencing the descent of the difficult part. Great care was being taken. Only one man was moving at a time. When he was firmly planted, the next advanced, and so on. They had not, however, attached the additional rope to the rocks, and nothing was said about it. The suggestion was not made for my own sake, and I am not sure that it even occurred to me again. For some little distance we too followed the others, detached from them, and should have continued so had not Lord F. Douglas asked me, about 3 p.m., to tie on to old Peter, as he feared, he said, that Taugwalder would not be able to hold his ground if a slip occurred. A few minutes later a sharp-eyed lad ran into the Monte Rosa Hotel to Zeiler, saying that he had seen an avalanche fall from the summit of the Matterhorn and onto the Matterhorn Gletscher. The boy was reproved for telling idle stories. He was right, nevertheless, and this was what he saw. Michel Croz had laid aside his axe, and in order to give Mr. Hadow greater security, was absolutely taking hold of his legs and putting his feet one by one into their proper positions. Footnote: not at all an unusual proceeding, even between born mountaineers. I wish to convey the impression that Croz was using all pains, rather than to indicate extreme inability on the part of Mr. Hadow. End footnote. As far as I know, no one was actually descending. I cannot speak with certainty, because the two leading men were partially hidden from my sight by an intervening mass of rock, but it is my belief, from the movements of their shoulders, that Croz, having done as I have said, was in the act of turning round to go down a step or two himself. At this moment Mr. Hadow slipped, fell against him, and knocked him over. I heard one startled exclamation from Croz, then saw him and Mr. Hadow flying downward. In another moment Hudson was dragged from his steps, and Lord F. Douglas immediately after him. Footnote: at the moment of the accident, Croz, Hadow, and Hudson were all close together. Between Hudson and Lord F. Douglas the rope was all but taut, and the same between all the others who were above. Croz was standing by the side of a rock which afforded good hold, and if he had been aware or had suspected that anything was about to occur, he might and would have gripped it, and would have prevented any mischief. He was taken totally by surprise. Mr. Hadow slipped off his feet onto his back. His feet struck Croz in the small of the back and knocked him right over head first. Croz's axe was out of his reach, and without it he managed to get his head uppermost before he disappeared from our sight. If it had been in his hand, I have no doubt that he would have stopped himself and Mr. Hadow. Mr. Hadow, at the moment of the slip, was not occupying a bad position. He could have moved either up or down, and could touch with his hand the rock of which I have spoken. Hudson was not so well placed, but he had liberty of motion. The rope was not taut from him to Hadow, and the two men fell 10 or 12 feet before the jerk came upon him. Lord F. Douglas was not favourably placed, and could move neither up or down. Old Peter was firmly planted, and stood just beneath a large rock which he hugged with both arms. I enter into these details to make it more apparent that the position occupied by the party at the moment of the accident was not by any means excessively trying. We were compelled to pass over the exact spot where the slip occurred, and we found, even with shaken nerves, that it was not a difficult place to pass. I have described the slope generally as difficult, and it is so undoubtedly to most persons, but it must be distinctly understood that Mr. Hadow slipped at an easy part. End of footnote. All this was the work of a moment. Immediately we heard Croz's exclamation, old Peter and I planted ourselves as firmly as the rocks would permit. The rope was taut between us, and the jerk came on us both as on one man. Footnote. Or, more correctly, we held on as tightly as possible. There was no time to change our position. End of footnote. We held, but the rope broke midway between Taugwalder and Lord Francis Douglas. For a few seconds we saw our unfortunate companions sliding downward on their backs and spreading out their hands, endeavoring to save themselves. They passed from our sight uninjured, disappeared one by one, and fell, from precipice to precipice, onto the Matterhorn gletscher below, a distance of nearly 4,000 feet in height. From the moment the rope broke, it was impossible to help them. So perished our comrades. For the space of half an hour we remained on the spot without moving a single step. The two men, paralyzed by terror, cried like infants, and trembled in such a manner as to threaten us with the fate of the others. Old Peter rent the air with exclamations of "Chamonix! Oh, what will Chamonix say?" He meant, who would believe that Croz could fall? The young man did nothing but scream or sob, "We are lost! We are lost!" Fixed between the two, I could move neither up nor down. I begged young Peter to descend, but he dared not. Unless he did, we could not advance. Old Peter became alive to the danger, and swelled the cry, "We are lost! We are lost!" The father's fear was natural. He trembled for his son. The young man's fear was cowardly. He thought of self alone. At last old Peter summed up courage and changed his position to a rock to which he could fix the rope. The young men then descended, and we all stood together. Immediately we did so, I asked for the rope which had given way, and found to my surprise, indeed to my horror, that it was the weakest of the three ropes. It was not brought, and should not have been employed, for the purpose for which it was used. It was old rope, and compared with the others was feeble. It was intended as a reserve, in case we had to leave much rope behind, attached to rocks. I saw at once that a serious question was involved, and made them give me the end. It had broken in mid-air, and it did not appear to have sustained previous injury. For more than 2 hours afterward, I thought almost every moment that the next would be my last, for the Taugwalders, utterly unnerved, were not only incapable of giving assistance, but were in such a state that a slip might have been expected from them at any moment. After a time we were able to do that which should have been done at first, and fixed rope to firm rocks in addition to being tied together. These ropes were cut from time to time and were left behind. Footnote. These ends, I believe, are still attached to the rocks, and mark our line of ascent and descent. End of footnote. Even with their assurance, the men were afraid to proceed, and several times old Peter turned with ashy face and faltering limbs, and said with terrible emphasis, "I cannot." About 6 p.m. we arrived at the snow upon the ridge descending towards Zermatt, and all peril was over. We frequently looked, but in vain, for traces of our unfortunate companions. We bent over the ridge and cried to them, but no sound returned. Convinced at last that they were within neither sight nor hearing, we ceased from our useless efforts, and, too cast down for speech, silently gathered up our things and the little effects of those who were lost, preparatory to continuing the descent. When lo! a mighty arch appeared, rising above the Lyskam high into the sky. Pale, colourless, and noiseless, but perfectly sharp and defined, except where it was lost in the clouds, this unearthly apparition seemed like a vision from another world, and almost appalled, we watched with amazement the gradual development of two vast crosses, one on either side. If the Taugwalders had not been the first to perceive it, I should have doubted my senses. They thought it had some connection with the accident, and I, after a while, that it might bear some relation to ourselves. But our movements had no effect on it. The spectral forms remained motionless. It was a fearful and wonderful sight, unique in my experience, and impressive beyond description, coming at such a moment. Footnote. See illustration. I paid very little attention to this remarkable phenomenon, and was glad when it disappeared, as it distracted our attention. Under ordinary circumstances I should have felt vexed afterward at not having observed with greater precision an occurrence so rare and so wonderful. I can add very little about it to that which is said above. The sun was directly at our backs. That is to say, the fog bow was opposite to the sun. The time was 6:30 p.m. The forms were at once tender and sharp, neutral in tone, were developed gradually, and disappeared suddenly. The mists were light, that is, not dense, and were dissipated in the course of the evening. It has been suggested that the crosses are incorrectly figured in the illustration, and that they were probably formed by the intersection of other circles or ellipses, as shown in the annexed diagram. I think this suggestion is very likely correct, but I have preferred to follow my original memorandum. In Parry's Narrative of an Attempt to Reach the North Pole, quarto, 1828, there is, at pages 99 and 100, an account of the occurrence of a phenomenon analogous to the above-mentioned one. At 5:30 p.m. we witnessed a very beautiful natural phenomenon. A broad white fog bow first appeared opposite to the sun, as was very commonly the case, etc. I follow Parry in using the term fog bow. End of footnote. I was ready to leave, and waiting for the others. They had recovered their appetites and the use of their tongues. They spoke in patois, which I did not understand. At length the son said in French, "Monsieur?" "Yes." "We are poor men. We have lost our hare. We shall not get paid. We can ill afford this." Footnote. They had been traveling with and had been engaged by Lord F. Douglas, and so considered him their employer and responsible to them. End footnote. "Stop," I said, interrupting him. "That is nonsense. I shall pay you, of course, just as if your hare were here." They talked together in their patois for a short time, and then the son spoke again. "We don't wish you to pay us. We wish you to write in the hotel book at Zermatt and to your journals that we have not been paid." "What nonsense are you talking? I don't understand you. What do you mean?" He proceeded. "Why, next year there will be many travelers at Zermatt, and we shall get more voyageurs." Who could answer such a proposition? I made them no reply in words, but they knew very well the indignation that I felt. Footnote. Nor did I speak to them afterward, unless it was absolutely necessary, so long as we were together. End footnote. They filled the cup of bitterness to overflowing, and I tore down the cliff madly and recklessly in a way that caused them more than once to inquire if I wished to kill them. Night fell, and for an hour the descent was continued in the darkness. At 9:30 a resting place was found, and upon a wretched slab, barely large enough to hold the three, we passed 6 miserable hours. At daybreak the descent was resumed, and from the Hörnli ridge we ran down to the chalet of Boule and on to Zermatt. Seiler met me at the door, and followed in silence to my room. "What is the matter?" "The Taugwalders and I have returned." He did not need more, and burst into tears, but lost no time in useless lamentations, and set to work to arouse the village. Ere long a score of men had started to ascend the Hohlicht heights above Kalbermatt and Smut, which commanded the plateau of the Matterhorn gletscher. They returned after 6 hours, and reported that they had seen the bodies lying motionless on the snow. This was on Saturday, and they proposed that we should leave on Sunday evening, so as to arrive upon the plateau at daybreak on Monday. Unwilling to lose the slightest chance, the Reverend J. McCormick and I resolved to start on Sunday morning. The Zermatt men, threatened with excommunication by their priests if they failed to attend the early mass, were unable to accompany us. To several of them, at least, this was a severe trial, and Peter Perrin declared with tears that nothing else would have prevented him from joining in the search for his old comrades. Englishmen came to our aid. The Reverend J. Robinson and Mr. J. Philpotts offered themselves and their guide, Frans Andermatten. Another Englishman lent us Joseph Marie and Alexandre Lochmatter. Frédéric Payot and Jean Tairraz of Chamonix also volunteered. We started at 2 a.m. on Sunday, the 16th, and followed the route that we had taken on the previous Thursday as far as the Hörnli. From thence we went down to the right of the ridge and mounted through the sérac of the Matterhorn glacier. By 8:30 we had got to the plateau at the top of the glacier, and within sight of the corner in which we knew my companions must be. As we saw one weather-beaten man after another raise the telescope, turn deadly pale and pass it on without a word to the next, we knew that all hope was gone. We approached. They had fallen below as they had fallen above. Croz a little in advance, Haddo near him, and Hudson some distance behind. But of Lord F. Douglas we could see nothing. Footnote: a pair of gloves, a belt, and boot that had belonged to him were found. This somehow became publicly known, and gave rise to wild notions, which would not have been entertained had it been also known that the boots of all those who had fallen were off and were lying upon the snow near the bodies. End footnote. We left them where they fell, buried in snow at the base of the grandest cliff of the most majestic mountain of the Alps. All those who had fallen had been tied with the manila, or with the second and equally strong rope, and consequently there had been only one link, that between old Peter and Lord F. Douglas, where the weaker rope had been used. This had a very ugly look for Taugwalder, for it was not possible to suppose that the others would have sanctioned the employment of a rope so greatly inferior in strength, when there were more than 250 feet of the better qualities still out of use. Footnote: I was 100 feet or more from the others whilst they were being tied up, and am unable to throw any light on the matter. Croz and old Peter no doubt tied up the others. End footnote. For the sake of the old guide, who bore a good reputation, and upon all other accounts, it was desirable that this matter should be cleared up, and after my examination before the court of inquiry which was instituted by the government was over, I handed in a number of questions which were framed so as to afford old Peter an opportunity of exculpating himself from the grave suspicions which at once fell upon him. The questions, I was told, were put and answered, but the answers, though promised, have never reached me. Footnote: this is not the only occasion upon which Monsieur Clemens, who presided over the inquiry, has failed to give up answers that he promised. It is greatly to be regretted that he does not feel that the suppression of the truth is equally against the interests of travelers and of the guides. If the men are untrustworthy, the public should be warned of the fact, but if they are blameless, why allow them to remain under unmerited suspicion? Old Peter Taugwalder is a man who is laboring under an unjust accusation. Notwithstanding repeated denials, even his comrades and neighbors at Zermatt persist in asserting or insinuating that he cut the rope which led from him to Lord F. Douglas. In regard to this infamous charge, I say that he could not do so at the moment of the slip, and that the end of the rope in my possession shows that he did not do so beforehand. There remains, however, the suspicious fact that the rope which broke was the thinnest and weakest one that we had. It is suspicious because it is unlikely that any of the four men in front would have selected an old and weak rope when there was an abundance of new and much stronger rope to spare, and on the other hand, because if Taugwalder thought that an accident was likely to happen, it was to his interest to have the weaker rope where it was placed. I should rejoice to learn that his answers to the questions which were put to him were satisfactory. Not only was his act at the critical moment wonderful as a feat of strength, but it was admirable in its performance at the right time. I am told that he is now nearly incapable of work, not absolutely mad, but with intellect gone and almost crazy, which is not to be wondered at, whether we regard him as a man who contemplated a scoundrelly meanness, or as an injured man suffering under an unjust accusation. In respect to young Peter, it is not possible to speak in the same manner. The odious idea that he propounded, which I believe emanated from him, he has endeavored to trade upon, in spite of the fact that his father was paid, for both, in the presence of witnesses. Whatever may be his abilities as a guide, he is not one to whom I would ever trust my life or afford any countenance. End of footnote. Meanwhile, the administration sent strict injunctions to recover the bodies, and upon the 19th of July 21 men of Zermatt accomplished that sad and dangerous task. Of the body of Lord Francis Douglas they too saw nothing. It is probably still arrested on the rocks above. Footnote. This or a subsequent party discovered a sleeve. No other traces have been found. End of footnote. The remains of Hudson and Hadow were interred upon the north side of the Zermatt church, in the presence of a reverent crowd of sympathizing friends. The body of Michel Croz lies upon the other side, under a simpler tomb, whose inscription bears honorable testimony to his rectitude, to his courage, and to his devotion. Footnote. At the instance of Mr. Alfred Wills, a subscription list was opened for the benefit of the sisters of Michel Croz, who had been partly dependent upon his earnings. In a short time more than £280 were raised. This was considered sufficient, and the list closed. The proceeds were invested in French rente by Mr. William Matthews, at the recommendation of M. Dupuy, at that time Mayor of Chamonix. End footnote. So the traditional inaccessibility of the Matterhorn was vanquished, and was replaced by legends of a more real character. Others will essay to scale its proud cliffs, but to none will it be the mountain that it was to its early explorers. Others may tread its summit snows, but none will ever know the feeling of those who first gaze upon its marvelous panorama, and none, I trust, will ever be compelled to tell of joy turned into grief, and of laughter into mourning. It proved to be a stubborn foe. It resisted long and gave many a hard blow. It was defeated at last with an ease that none could have anticipated, but like a relentless enemy conquered but not crushed, it took terrible vengeance. The time may come when the Matterhorn shall have passed away, and nothing save a heap of shapeless fragments will mark the spot where the great mountain stood, for atom by atom, inch by inch, and yard by yard, it yields to forces which nothing can withstand. That time is far distant, and ages hence generations unborn will gaze upon its awful precipices and wonder at its unique form. However exalted may be their ideas, and however exaggerated their expectations, none will ever come to return disappointed. The play is over, and the curtain is about to fall. Before we part, a word upon the graver teachings of the mountains. See yonder height. 'Tis far away, unbidden comes the word impossible. Not so, says the mountaineer. The way is long, I know. It's difficult. It may be dangerous. It's possible, I'm sure. I'll seek the way, take counsel of my brother mountaineers, and find how they have gained similar heights, and learn to avoid the dangers. He starts, all slumbering down below. The path is slippery, may be laborious too. Caution and perseverance gain the day, the height is reached, and those beneath cry, "Incredible! 'Tis superhuman!" We who go mountain scrambling have constantly set before us the superiority of fixed purpose or perseverance to brute force. We know that each height, each step, must be gained by patient, laborious toil, and that wishing cannot take the place of working. We know the benefits of mutual aid, that many a difficulty must be encountered, and many an obstacle must be grappled with or turned. But we know that where there's a will, there's a way, and we come back to our daily occupations better fitted to fight the battle of life, and to overcome the impediments which obstruct our paths, strengthened and cheered by the recollection of past labors and by the memories of victories gained in other fields. I have not made myself an advocate or an apologist for mountaineering, nor do I now intend to usurp the functions of a moralist, but my task would have been ill performed if it had been concluded without one reference to the more serious lessons of the mountaineer. We glory in the physical regeneration which is the product of our exertions. We exult over the grandeur of the scenes that are brought before our eyes, the splendors of sunrise and sunset, and the beauties of hill, dale, lake, wood, and waterfall. But we value more highly the development of manliness, and the evolution, under combat with difficulties, of those noble qualities of human nature, courage, patience, endurance, and fortitude. Some hold these virtues in less estimation, and assign base and contemptible motives to those who indulge in our innocent sport. Be thou chaste as ice, as pure as snow, thou shalt not escape calumny. Others again, who are not detractors, find mountaineering as a sport to be wholly unintelligible. It is not greatly to be wondered at. We are not all constituted alike. Mountaineering is a pursuit essentially adapted to the young or vigorous, and not to the old or feeble. To the latter, toil may be no pleasure, and it is often said by such persons, "This man is making a toil of pleasure." Toil he must who goes mountaineering, but out of the toil comes strength, not merely muscular strength, more than that, an awakening of all the faculties, and from the strength arises pleasure. Then again it is often asked, in tones which seem to imply that the answer must at least be doubtful, "But does it repay you?" Well, we cannot estimate our enjoyment as you measure your wine or weigh your lead. It is real, nevertheless. If I could blot out every reminiscence or erase every memory, still I should say that my scrambles amongst the Alps have repaid me, for they have given me two of the best things a man can possess, health and friends. The recollections of past pleasures cannot be effaced. Even now as I write they crowd up before me. First comes an endless series of pictures, magnificent in form, effect, and color. I see the great peaks with clouded tops, seeming to mount up for ever and ever. I hear the music of the distant herds, the peasants' yodel and the solemn church bells, and I scent the fragrant breath of the pines. And after these have passed away, another train of thoughts succeeds, of those who have been upright, brave, and true, of kind hearts and bold deeds, and of courtesies received at stranger hands, trifles in themselves, but expressive of that good will toward men which is the essence of charity. Still, the last sad memory hovers round, and sometimes drifts across like floating mist, cutting off sunshine and chilling the remembrance of happier times. There have been joys too great to be described in words, and there have been griefs upon which I have not dared to dwell. And with these in mind I say, climb if you will, but remember that courage and strength are naught without prudence, and that a momentary negligence may destroy the happiness of a lifetime. Do nothing in haste, look well to each step, and from the beginning think what may be the end. End of chapter 22. Appendices A and B of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix A, Subsequent Ascents of the Matterhorn. Mr. Crawford Grove was the first traveler who ascended the Matterhorn after the accident. This was in August, 1867. He took with him as guides 3 mountaineers of the Val Tournanche, J. A. Carrel, J. Biche, and S. Meynet, Carrel being the leader. The natives of the Val Tournanche were, of course, greatly delighted that his ascent was made upon their side. Some of them, however, were by no means well pleased that J. A. Carrel was so much regarded. They feared, perhaps, that he would acquire the monopoly of the mountain. Just a month after Mr. Grove's ascent, 6 Val-Tournanchians set out to see whether they could not learn the route, and so come in for a share of the good things which were expected to arrive. They were the 3 Maquinazes, César Carrel, my old guide, J.B. Carrel, and a daughter of the last named. They left Breuil at 5 a.m. on September 12, and at 3 p.m. arrived at the hut where they passed the night. At 7 a.m. the next day they started again, leaving J.B. Carrel behind, and proceeded along the shoulder to the final peak, passed the cleft which had stopped Benin, and clambered up the comparatively easy rocks on the other side until they arrived at the base of the last precipice, down which we had hurled stones on July 14, 1865. They, young woman and all, were then about 350 feet from the summit. Then, instead of turning to the left, as Carrel and Mr. Grove had done, Joseph and J. Pierre Maquinaz paid attention to the cliff in front of them, and managed to find a means of passing up, by clefts, ledges, and gullies, to the summit. This was a shorter, and it appears to be an easier route than that taken by Carrel and Grove, and it has been followed by all those who have since then ascended the mountain from the side of Breuil. Subsequently a rope was fixed over the most difficult portions of the final climb. In the meantime they had not been idle upon the other side. A hut was constructed upon the eastern face, at a height of 12,526 feet above the sea, near to the crest of the ridge which descends toward Zermatt, northeast ridge. This was done at the expense of M. Seiler and of the Swiss Alpine Club. M. Seiler placed the execution of the work under the direction of the Knubels, of the village of St. Nicholas in the Zermatt Valley, and Peter Knubel, along with Joseph Marie Lochmatter of the same village, had the honor of making the second ascent of the mountain upon the northern side with Mr. Elliot. This took place on July 24th and 25th, 1868. Since then numerous ascents have been made, and of these the only one which calls for mention is that by Signor Giordano on September 3 to 5, 1868. This gentleman came to Breuil several times after his famous visit in 1865, with the intention of making the ascent, but he was always baffled by weather. In July 1866 he got as high as the Cravate, with J. A. Carrel and other men, and was detained there 5 days and nights, unable to move either up or down. At last, upon the above-named date, he was able to gratify his desires, and accomplished the feat of ascending the mountain upon one side and descending it upon the other. Signor Giordano is, I believe, the only geologist who has ascended the Matterhorn. He spent a considerable time in the examination of its structure, and became benighted on its eastern face in consequence. End of Appendix A. Appendix B. Denudation in the valley of the Durance. In the summer of 1869, whilst walking up the valley of the Durance from Mont Dauphin to Briançon, I noticed, when about 5 kilomètres from the latter place, some pinnacles on the mountain slopes to the west of the road. I scrambled up and found the remarkable natural pillars which are represented in the annexed engraving. They were formed out of an unstratified conglomerate of gritty earth, boulders, and stones. Some of them were more thickly studded with stones than a plum pudding usually is with plums, whilst from others the stones projected like the spines from an echinoderm. The earth, or mud, was extremely hard and tenacious, and the stones embedded in it were extricated with considerable difficulty. The mud adhered very firmly to the stones that were got out, but it was readily washed away in a little stream near at hand. In a few minutes I extracted fragments of syenite, mica schist, several kinds of limestone and conglomerates, and some fossil plants characteristic of carboniferous strata. Most of the fragments were covered with scratches, which told that they had traveled underneath a glacier. The mud had all the character of glacier mud, and the hillside was covered with drift. From these indications, and from the situation of the pinnacles, I concluded that they had been formed out of an old moraine. The greatest of them were 60 to 70 feet high, and the moraine had therefore been at least that height. I judged from appearances that the moraine was the frontal terminal one of a glacier which had been an affluent of the great glacier that formerly occupied the valley of the Durance, and which during retrogression had made a stand upon this hillside near Sachat. This lateral glacier had flowed down a nameless vallon which descends toward the east-southeast from the mountain called upon the French government map Sommet de l'Échaudin, 8,740 feet. Only one of all the pinnacles that I saw was capped by a stone, a small one, and I did not notice any boulders lying in their immediate vicinity of a size sufficient to account for their production in the manner of the celebrated pillars near Botzen. The readers of Sir Charles Lyell's Principles, 10th edition, volume 1, page 338, will remember that he attributes the formation of the Botzen pillars chiefly to the protection which the boulders have afforded to the underlying matter from the direct action of rain. This is no doubt correct. The Botzen pinnacles are mostly capped by boulders of considerable dimensions. In the present instance, this does not appear to have been exactly the case. Running water has cut the moraine into ridges, shown upon the right hand of the engraving, and has evidently assisted in the work of denudation. The group of pinnacles here figured belonged, in all probability, to a ridge which had been formed in this way, whose crest in course of time became sharp, perhaps attenuated. In such a condition very little stones upon the crest of the ridge would originate little pinnacles. Whether these would develop into larger ones would depend upon the quality of the stones embedded in the surrounding moraine matter. I imagine that the largest of the Sachat pinnacles owe their existence to the portions of the moraine out of which they are formed having been studded with a greater quantity of stones and small boulders than the portions of the moraine which formerly filled the gaps between them, and, of course, primarily to the fact that glacier mud is extremely tenacious when dry and is readily washed away. Thus the present form of the pinnacles is chiefly due to the direct action of rain, but their production was assisted in the first instance by the action of running water. End of Appendix B. End of Scrambles Amongst the Alps by Edward Whymper.